Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the fading light of a winter dusk on the coast of 9th century Hordaland, the sea mist curled around the keels of a fleet of longships, and the men who disembarked were not men at all, or so the terrified villagers of a rival chieftain's settlement believed. They came ashore not in the glint of chain mail, but in the matted pelts of grey wolves, their heads crowned by the snarling upper jaws of the beasts, their bare chests and arms painted with the spiral symbols of Odin's binding knot. These were the Úlfhéðnar, the wolf coats, the chosen warriors of the hanged god, and their very appearance was a calculated act of psychological warfare that struck the defenders with a paralysis of supernatural dread before a single axe was swung. The historical and literary sources of the Viking Age, from the skaldic poem Hraftsmal to the Icelandic sagas, distinguish these wolf-skin wearers from the more famous Berserkers, the bear shirts, and place them in an even more exclusive and terrifying category of sacred, frenzied fighters who were believed to be possessed by the spirit of the wolf itself. The Old Norse compound lupine, plural Úlfhéðnar, is itself a precise theological statement. Ulfr is the wolf, and hin is a word of obscure origin but likely related to a hooded garment of skin, a man who has been wrapped in the very essence of the predator. The archaeological record, though fragmentary due to the organic nature of the pelts, has provided us with direct visual evidence of these figures in the famous Torslunda bronze helmet plates from the Swedish island of Öland, dated to the Vendel period around the 6th to 8th centuries CE, where a warrior wearing a wolf skin over a tunic, with a tail dangling from the rear, brandishes a spear in a ritual dance. This image, which predates the classic Viking Age by a century or two, demonstrates that the cult of the wolf warrior was a deep, archaic stratum of Germanic warrior spirituality, a current that would surface with explosive power during the great raids of the 9th and 10th centuries. The Úlfhéðnar were not a reaction to the chaos of the age. They were a deliberate, highly trained, and ritually prepared expression of a much older shamanic tradition, a tradition that understood the battlefield not as a human political arena but as a sacrificial ground where the spirit of the wolf, channeled by the living warrior, fed the eternal hunger of Odin for the souls of the slain. To truly grasp the horror and the awe that these warriors inspired, we must abandon the modern, sanitized image of the Viking and step into a world where the boundaries between the human, the animal, and the divine were dangerously, and deliberately, blurred, and where the ultimate weapon was not the sword but the transformation of the self into a living, breathing agent of the All-Father's apocalyptic will. The deep connection between the Úlfhéðnar and the god Odin is written into the very structure of the Norse cosmos, a cosmos in which the wolf is the supreme symbol of divine, uncontrollable power and the chosen companion of the chief of the gods. In the Eddic poem Grimnismal, Odin reveals to the mortal Agnar that he sits in Valhalla with two wolves, Geri and Freki, whose names both mean the ravenous one, and that he gives them all the food that is set before him, for he himself lives on wine alone. This sacred feeding of the wolves is not a mere domestic scene. It is a theological model for the relationship between Odin and his earthly wolf warriors. The god, the supreme chieftain, distributes the spoils of battle, the souls of the slain, to his wolves, who in turn fight with a ferocity that is a direct reflection of their master's insatiable hunger for the Einherjar, the army of the dead that will fight at Ragnarok. The Úlfhéðnar, by donning the wolf skin and entering the battle frenzy, were reenacting this divine relationship in the human realm. They were the Geri and Freki of the earthly chieftain, the receivers of the first and choicest shares of the plunder, the men who stood at the right hand of the king in the shield wall, their bodies the living altars of the Odin cult. The skaldic poem Haraldfairhair, composed by the poet Orbjörn Hornklofi in the late 9th century to celebrate the victory of King Harald Fairhair at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, provides one of the earliest and most vivid contemporary descriptions of these wolf-skinned warriors. The poem states that Harald's ship was crewed by Úlfhéðnar, who were called wolf-skins. They were warriors who bore bloody shields and reddened spear points in the assault. They were the strongest and the bravest of the king's men. The poet, in the very next stanza, contrasts these wolf-skinned elite with the Berserkers, the bear shirts, who were also present, suggesting a clear, hierarchical differentiation within the Odin cult's military structure. The Úlfhéðnar, by their exclusive association with the wolf, were signaling a closer, more intimate bond with Odin than even the bear warriors, for the wolf was the animal of the god's own personal retinue, the predator that shared his hall and his nature, while the bear was a more generalized symbol of strength and solitary ferocity. This theological distinction would have profound consequences for the organization, the tactics, and the social status of the wolf warriors, marking them as the inner circle, the comitatus of the god himself, and the human chieftain who commanded them was, by extension, an earthly incarnation of Odin's divine, predatory sovereignty. The terrifying battlefield efficacy of the Úlfhéðnar was rooted in a state of altered consciousness known as Berserkers, for the bear shirts, and by extension, a wolf-specific variant that we might term Úlfhéðnar, a condition of sacred fury that was induced by a complex ritual preparation involving fasting, sensory deprivation, and possibly the consumption of psychoactive substances. The Norse sources, such as the Ynglinga saga of Snorri Sturluson, provide a detailed account of this frenzy. Odin's men went to battle without armor, and were as frantic as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could harm them, and this is called Berserkers. The saga writer, a Christian compiling the pagan past, is clearly describing a phenomenon that was both revered and feared, a state in which the warrior's physical and psychological limits were utterly dissolved by a flood of adrenaline and dissociative ecstasy. The Úlfhéðnar, in this state, were reported to howl like wolves, to gnaw at the rims of their shields with a terrifying, non-human violence, and to rush into battle with a disregard for their own lives that was not bravery in the conventional sense but a kind of sacred death-seeking, a desire to be killed in such a way that the soul would be instantly translated to Odin's hall. The trance was not a spontaneous outburst of rage but a carefully cultivated ritual technology, and the wolf's skin itself was the central instrument of the transformation. By donning the pelt, the warrior did not merely disguise himself, he underwent a Hamfarir, a soul journey, in which his own ham, the shaped soul, the animal form of the self, was released and the spirit of the wolf entered his body, displacing the human consciousness and replacing it with the cold, tactical intelligence of the pack hunter. The Úlfhéðnar, unlike the solitary, bear-like rages of the Berserkers, are described in several sources as fighting in a coordinated, pack-like formation, using howls and body language to communicate in the chaos of the shield wall, a behavior that reflects the actual hunting strategies of wolves and suggests that the wolf cult had developed a system of non-verbal tactical signals that were taught during the initiation. The psychological effect of this on an opposing force was devastating. The Frankish and Anglo-Saxon chronicles are filled with descriptions of entire battle lines breaking at the mere sight of the wolf-skinned warriors, their discipline shattered by the primal terror of confronting what appeared to be not men but supernatural monsters, the very hounds of the heathen gods. The specific connection between the Úlfhéðnar and the religious concept of the divine frenzy, the inspiration that is the etymological and spiritual root of Odin's own name, is the key to understanding why these warriors were more than mere shock troops. Is a word of immense semantic density in Old Norse. It means mind, wit, soul, poetry, and ecstatic fury all at once, and it is the substance that Odin, the All-Father, pours into the chosen mortal to elevate him above the limitations of ordinary humanity. The Úlfhéðnar, in their battle trance, were vessels of living conduits of the god's own mental essence, and their violence was therefore not merely destructive but creative, a sacred poetry of the spear and the severed limb, a gory art that was dedicated to the glory of the god. The skaldic poets, who themselves were masters of in its verbal form, frequently celebrated the wolf warriors in verses that drew an explicit parallel between the divine inspiration of the poet and the divine frenzy of the warrior, suggesting that the two roles were, in the deepest sense, identical. Both were possessed by Odin, both were instruments of his will, and both were, during the moment of their ecstatic performance, temporarily divine. The Úlfhéðnar, by this logic, were the poets of violence, their battle songs the howls of the wolf, their stanzas the coordinated strikes of the pack, and their ultimate poem the heap of enemy dead that they left behind as an offering to the god. The initiation rituals that produced this state of permanent divine possession are not fully documented, but a careful reading of the sagas and the comparative anthropology of other shamanic warrior cults allows us to reconstruct a probable scenario. The young warrior, having been selected by the chieftain or by a dream vision of Odin, would be taken to a remote location in the forest or the mountains, where he would undergo a period of isolation, fasting, and exposure to the elements, a symbolic death of the human self. He would then be invested with the wolf pelt in a ceremony that likely involved the drinking of the blood of a sacrificial wolf, the swearing of an oath of absolute loyalty to Odin and to the chieftain on a sacred ring, and the ritual scarring of the body to mark him as a member of the wolf pack. The result was a warrior who was, in the eyes of the community, no longer fully human, a being who existed in a permanent state of liminality, revered as a holy defender and feared as a potentially uncontrollable monster, a living paradox who embodied the terrifying truth that the divine, in its rawest form, was a force of uncontainable, predatory destruction. The social and legal position of the Úlfhéðnar within the Viking Age warband was, from the very beginning, a deeply ambivalent one, a paradox of high honor and profound danger that would eventually lead to their suppression and eradication. On the one hand, the wolf warriors were the most prestigious and highly rewarded members of the chieftain's here, the personal bodyguard, and they were granted the first pick of the plunder, the best seats at the mead bench, and a share of the chieftain's own hamingja, luck, that was believed to be the source of their supernatural power. The Hrafnsmod describes Harald Fairhair's Úlfhéðnar as the foremost of the king's champions, and the king's ability to command such a force was a major factor in his successful unification of Norway, a military and psychological dominance that the petty kings of the Fylki could not match. The rune stone of the Island of Man, dating from the late 10th century, bears an inscription that commemorates a warrior who is explicitly identified as an Úlfinn, a public, lapidary declaration of the prestige of the wolf cult and a sign that the wearers of the wolf skin were celebrated as heroes by their communities. On the other hand, the very same sources that praise the wolf warriors also hint at the dark side of their power, their tendency to turn their frenzy against their own comrades, their inability to function in the settled, agrarian society of the farmstead, and the terror they inspired in the civilian population, who saw them as a dangerous and unpredictable force. The Egil's saga contains a memorable episode in which the hero Egil Skallagrimsson, a man of legendary strength and temper, is pitted against a berserker who has gone out of control, and the saga notes, with a grim satisfaction, that Egil kills the man, a foreshadowing of the future fate of the frenzied warrior in Norse law. The Úlfhéðnar, by their very nature as living embodiments of the wolf, were a threat to the social order that they were sworn to defend, a standing invitation to chaos that required constant, vigilant management by the chieftain. And as the Viking Age wore on and the chaotic raiding economy gave way to the settled, Christian kingdoms of the north, the social contract that had sustained the wolf cult began to unravel. And the holy predators of Odin became the hunted outlaws of a new, more ordered world. To understand the Úlfhéðnar, we must first descend into the mythic and ritual landscape of the pre-Viking Germanic religion, a world in which the wolf was not a mere animal but a cosmic force, a symbol of destruction, rebirth, and the ultimate, ungovernable power that lies at the heart of the Odinic revelation. The Eddic poem Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy, describes the end of the world, Ragnarok, as a time when the great wolf Fenrir, the son of Loki, will break his magical fetter, Gleipnir, and run loose across the earth, his jaws gaping so wide that they touch the sky and the earth, and he will devour Odin himself. This apocalyptic wolf is the ultimate expression of the predatory principle that the Úlfhéðnar channeled in a controlled, ritualized form. They were, in a sense, a domesticated, human version of Fenrir, a wolf bound by the oaths of the Fellig and the Thing but always, potentially, on the verge of breaking loose. The myth of Odin's sacrifice on the world tree Yggdrasil, recounted in the Havamal, is itself a shamanic initiation that parallels the ordeal of the wolf warrior. Odin hangs for 9 nights, wounded by a spear. Myself given to myself. Without food or drink, until he screams out and seizes the runes, the magic of the cosmos. This is the template for the Úlfhéðnar's ordeal, the isolation, the fasting, the symbolic death, and the seizure of the wolf's power, the runes of the predator. The wolf, in this mythological scheme, is the animal that is most closely associated with the hanged god, the god of the gallows, for the gallows is the tree of the wolf, and the dead hanging from it are the offerings to the wolves, a grim circuit of sacrifice that the Úlfhéðnar, as the priests of this cult, enacted on the battlefield with the bodies of their enemies. The 9th century skald Bragi Boddason, the first known skald of the Norse tradition, composed a poem for the Swedish king Bjorn at the Barrow in which he refers to the slain enemies as the wolf's meal. A phrase that is not merely a conventional kenning but a precise theological statement. The dead are the sacrifice, the wolf is the god's animal, and the warrior who kills in the frenzy is the priest of this bloody liturgy. The archaeological record of the Vendel and early Viking periods provides a series of vivid, enigmatic images that seem to depict the wolf warrior in the act of his ritual transformation, a visual theology that is as potent as any written text. The Torslunda helmet plates, discovered in a smith's hoard on the island of Åland, are a set of 4 bronze dies that were used to stamp the decorated panels of ceremonial helmets, and they date from the period around 600–700 CE, a full century before the Viking Age proper. One of the plates, known as Torslunda Plat A, depicts a warrior with a sword and a circular shield who is wearing a wolf skin, the head of the wolf forming a hood over his own head, the skin draping down his back, and a tail clearly visible between his legs. The figure is not in a static pose but is depicted in a dynamic, dancing motion, his spear raised, his one eye, a detail that suggests a possible identification with the one-eyed Odin, staring intently at the viewer. This is not a hunter. This is a ritual performer, a man engaged in a sacred dance that is the preparatory phase of the Úlfhéðnar, the induction of the battle trance. A second plate, Torslunda Plat B, shows a similar figure, but this one is juxtaposed with a bare-skinned warrior, a berserker, and the two are clearly linked as a pair, a visual confirmation of the skaldic distinction between the two cults. The presence of these dies in a smith's hoard suggests that the image of the wolf warrior was not a rare, esoteric symbol but a standard, mass-produced piece of military iconography, a sign that the cult of the Úlfhéðnar was widely known and officially sanctioned by the warrior elite of the Vendel period. The smith who owned these dies was producing helmets that literally stamped the wearer with the image of the divine wolf, a magical act of protection and empowerment that turned the helmet into a portable shrine of the Odin cult. The helmets that these dies produced, when worn by a chieftain or a champion, would have been a terrifying sight, a metal skin that declared the wearer to be under the protection of the god and a participant in the wolf pack, a material, permanent Hamfarir that blurred the line between the man and the myth. The cult of the Úlfhéðnar, as it enters the historical record of the Viking Age in the 9th century, is not a uniform, monolithic institution but a diverse, decentralized network of local warrior lodges, each bound to a particular chieftain and each with its own specific traditions, initiatory rituals, and internal hierarchy. The Hrafsmal, our most important contemporary source, describes the Úlfhéðnar of Harald Fairhair as a distinct group within the king's army, men who bore no shields in the battle, but were clad in wolf skins, and were the bravest of the champions. The poet, who is presenting a panegyric to the king, is careful to note that these warriors were selected, that they were not a random mob but an elite corps, a fact that implies a rigorous process of recruitment and training that would have taken years to complete. The saga literature, composed later but preserving older oral traditions, provides a more detailed picture of how a warrior became an Úlfinn. In the Volsunga saga, the hero Sigmund and his son Sinfjotli, outlaws in the forest, come across a hut where 2 sleeping men are wearing wolf skins. The saga recounts that the skins are magical, and that whoever dons them becomes a wolf, speaking in the howls of the beast and roaming the forest in a pack, killing men at will. Sigmund and Sinfjotli put on the skins and are immediately transformed, a story that is a mythic account of the initiation ritual. The candidate dons the pelt of the wolf, perhaps a consecrated pelt taken from a sacred animal, or an enemy slain in a ritual combat, and by doing so, he takes on the hammer, the shaped soul, of the wolf, becoming a participant in the divine pack. The saga notes that the men were unable to remove the skins for 9 days, a period that corresponds to the 9 nights of Odin's hanging on the tree, and that they killed many men during their wolf wandering, a violent, ecstatic release that is the psychic core of the initiation. The story of Sigmund and Sinfjotli is a myth, but it encodes the memory of a real ritual, a ritual of symbolic death and rebirth as a predator that was the gateway to the Úlfhéðnar. The physical and psychological training that produced the Úlfhéðnar was, by any measure, one of the most extreme systems of warrior conditioning in the history of human conflict. A system that combined the physical rigors of prolonged cold exposure and starvation with the psychological techniques of sensory deprivation, rhythmic movement, and collective trance induction. The Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon, writing in the 10th century about the Varangian Guard of the Emperor, describes the Norse warriors as fighting with a mad fury, and notes that they were impervious to pain, and their strength was that of wild beasts. While Leo does not explicitly identify these warriors as Úlfhéðnar, his description of their animal-like ferocity and their trance-state aligns perfectly with the Norse accounts of the wolf-skinned champions. The training that produced this state would have begun in childhood, with the exposure of the future warrior to the elements, the teaching of the secret songs and chants that induce the trance, and the gradual, progressive introduction to the wolf pelt and its associated spirits. The sagas hint at the use of a special shield-biting ritual, known as skaldarbit, which was a part of the pre-battle frenzy. The warrior would gnaw at the iron rim of his shield, his eyes rolling back, foam flecking his lips, a performance that was at once a display of ferocity for the enemy and a self-induced dissociative state that flooded the brain with endorphins and adrenaline. The famous Lewis chessmen, carved from walrus ivory in the 12th century, include a figure of a knight, the rook, who is biting his shield in exactly this manner, a visual reference to the Berserkers that had survived into the Christian era as a cultural memory. The Úlfhéðnar, in their wolf state, were said to be able to endure wounds that would fell a normal man, a phenomenon that has a modern physiological explanation in the body's acute stress response, which can temporarily shut down the peripheral circulation and suppress the sensation of pain, but which, in the context of the Viking Age, was interpreted as a literal divine invulnerability. A gift from Odin that could only be received by those who had undergone the full, terrifying ordeal of the wolf skin initiation. The connection between the Úlfhéðnar and the wider shamanic traditions of the circumpolar north is a matter of intense scholarly debate, but there are striking parallels that suggest the Norse wolf cult was a local, Germanic expression of a much older, pan-Arctic complex of beliefs about the transformation of the human into the animal. The Sami Noidi, the shaman of the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, used drums, chants, and the skins of reindeer and bears to enter a trance and journey to the spirit world, a practice that is well documented in the ethnographic record and that has clear structural similarities to the Hamfarir of the Norse warrior. The Norse god Odin himself is, in many respects, a shamanic figure. He is the master of the gallows, the lord of the hanged, the one-eyed wanderer who travels between the worlds, and he is accompanied by a pack of wolves and ravens, the classic shamanic animal familiars. The Úlfhéðnar, as the earthly servants of this shamanic god, were the practitioners of a warrior shamanism, a technique for turning the battlefield into a spirit journey and the enemy dead into a sacrifice to the divine pack. The Sami and the Norse were in close contact throughout the Viking Age, and the Norse sagas are full of references to Sami sorcerers and their magical powers. It is very likely that the wolf cult of Odin was influenced, perhaps decisively, by the shamanic practices of the circumpolar neighbors, a borrowing that was then transformed and intensified by the violent, competitive dynamics of the Viking chieftaincies. The Úlfhéðnar, therefore, were not a static, traditional institution but a dynamic, evolving cult that was constantly absorbing new influences and adapting to the changing conditions of the Viking expansion, a living religion of the predator that was, like the wolf itself, a master of survival and adaptation. The initiation ritual of the Úlfhéðnar, as we can cautiously reconstruct it from the fragmentary saga narratives, the comparative anthropology of warrior cults, and the archaeological evidence of sacrificial sites, was a harrowing ordeal of symbolic death, animal communion, and sacred rebirth that marked the candidate as a permanent outsider to normal human society. The locus classicus for the wolf initiation is the story of Sigmund and Sinfjotli in the Volsunga saga, a text of the late 13th century that preserves a much older, oral tradition of the Odinic warrior cult. The saga recounts that the father and son, outlaws hiding in the forest, discover a hut in which two men, the sons of a king, are sleeping under a spell, their wolf skins hanging on the wall beside them. Sigmund and Sinfjotli, acting on an impulse that the saga presents as divinely inspired, steal the skins and put them on, and they are immediately, involuntarily transformed into wolves. The saga is explicit about the nature of the transformation. They howled like wolves, and each understood the other's howling. They ran through the forest, and they killed men, and they did this for 9 days. The 9-day period is the crucial detail. It is the same length as Odin's hanging on the world tree, and it represents a liminal, sacred interval during which the initiates are neither human nor animal but suspended between the two, in the hammer of the wolf. The saga notes that the two men agree not to attack each other, but that if they encountered a pack of more than 7 men, they were to howl for help, a detail that suggests a tactical code, a pack logic that was embedded in the very nature of the transformation. At the end of the 9 days, the men are able to remove the skins, and they burn them, a final, purifying act that closes the ritual. This myth is not a literal account of an historical event, it is an encoded memory of a real initiatory ordeal, a ritual in which the candidate, under the supervision of an elder lupine, donned the consecrated pelt, entered a trance state, and acted out the role of the wolf in the wild, a process that could have lasted for days and that would have been both physically exhausting and psychologically transformative, eroding the boundaries of the human self and implanting a new, predatory identity in its place. The physical setting of the initiation ritual was likely a sacred grove or a secluded cave, a place that was set apart from the human community and dedicated to Odin, the god of the gallows and the wild. The candidate, having been selected by the chieftain or by a prophetic dream, would have been led to this place by a group of senior wolf warriors, the Varangian leaders of the pack. The first stage of the ritual was probably a period of fasting, sleep deprivation, and exposure, a classic shamanic technique for inducing an altered state of consciousness, which could have lasted for 3 days, or 9, depending on the local tradition. The purpose of this ordeal was to weaken the candidate's attachment to his human identity, to starve the man out of him, and make him receptive to the spirit of the wolf. The second stage was the donning of the wolf skin, an act that was not merely a costume change but a sacramental event, a Hamfarir in which the candidate's own hammer was believed to leave his body and the spirit of the sacred wolf, perhaps the spirit of a specific ancestral wolf that was the totem of the warrior lodge, entered in its place. The skin itself was likely taken from a wolf that had been hunted and killed in a ritual combat, a single combat between the candidate and the wolf, with the candidate armed only with a spear and the wolf's skin of a previous initiate, a deadly test that, if survived, would confer an immediate, visceral connection to the spirit of the slain beast. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century CE about the Germanic tribes of the Chatti, describes a very similar ritual. The young warrior, upon reaching manhood, is made to wear an iron ring, a mark of shame, until he kills an enemy in battle, at which point the ring is removed and he is accepted into the warrior band. The wolf skin of the Úlfhéðnar may have functioned in the same way, a mark of liminality and potential that was only fully activated by the successful completion of a test of blood. The third stage of the initiation was the Úlfhéðnar itself, the enactment of the wolf trance, in which the candidate, now clad in the skin and surrounded by the howling, chanting pack, entered a state of divine frenzy and participated in a mock battle or a real raid, a Viking in the literal sense, to prove his possession by the spirit of Odin. The sagas hint at the use of a special brew, perhaps a mixture of mead, the sacred drink of Odin, and psychoactive herbs such as the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, or the bog bilberry, Vaccinium uliginosum, which are known to have been used by the Sami shamans and which can induce a state of dissociative, aggressive excitement. The candidate, in this state, would have been expected to demonstrate the classic signs of the Berserkers, the shield biting, the howling, the insensibility to pain, and the superhuman strength that the sources so vividly describe. The senior warriors would have engaged the candidate in combat, testing his ability to fight in the coordinated, pack-like manner that distinguished Úlfhéðnar from the solitary rages of the Berserkers, and if he passed the test, he would be accepted into the pack, a new wolf of Odin, a living weapon of the god. The final stage of the ritual was the marking of the new warrior, perhaps with a ritual scarification, the cutting of the skin to create a permanent mark of the wolf, a sign that the candidate's body now belonged to Odin and to the pack, and that his human identity was secondary, a mere husk that could be discarded at any moment. The archaeological discovery of a mass grave at the site of the Viking winter camp of Repton in Derbyshire, which contained the remains of warriors who had been subjected to massive, non-fatal trauma, including the deliberate filing of teeth into points, may be evidence of such ritual markings, a physical, permanent transformation of the body into that of a predator, a wolf in human flesh. The legal and social consequences of the initiation were profound and permanent. The new Úlfhéðn was no longer a normal member of the Bondi class, the free farmers who were the backbone of Norse society. He was now a vargur, a wolf, a being who existed outside the normal bonds of the clan, and whose primary loyalty was to the pack and to the chieftain who served as the Alpha Ulfr, the Alpha Wolf, of the warrior lodge. The Grágás lawbook of the Icelandic Free State, which was compiled later but preserves older customary laws, contains a number of provisions that suggest the ambiguous legal status of the frenzied warrior. A man who entered the Berserkers in a public place and caused a disturbance could be sued for a fine, and a man who killed a frenzied warrior in self-defense was not liable for the wergild, a stark indication that the law viewed the Úlfhéðn as a danger to the community. The law also contains a famous provision that a man who commits a murder by manslaughter, while in a state of awe, is to be judged more harshly than a man who kills in cold blood, because the frenzy is considered an aggravation, not an excuse, a sign that the pagan's sacred madness had become, in the Christian legal mind, a mark of diabolical possession. The Úlfhéðnar, by their initiation, had voluntarily placed themselves in this legal limbo, a state of permanent, sacred outlawry in which their only protection was the power of the chieftain and the fear they inspired in their enemies, a precarious existence that was as dangerous as it was glorious, and that would, in the end, prove unsustainable in a world that was increasingly hostile to the old, wild gods of the north. The psychological transformation that the initiation produced was not a temporary, reversible state but a permanent, deep-seated alteration of the warrior's personality, a condition that modern psychiatry might diagnose as a complex, culturally bound dissociative disorder, but which the Norse interpreted as a divine possession. The Úlfhéðn, once initiated, was believed to have a dual soul, a human soul and a wolf hammer, which could be activated at will, or involuntarily, by the stresses of battle and the rituals of the pack. The sagas contain many stories of warriors who, even in times of peace, were subject to sudden, uncontrollable fits of the berserksgangr, a condition that was known as berserksy, berserker rage, and which could be triggered by the sight of blood, by the taunts of a rival, or by the simple approach of the evening, the time when the wolf, the managarmr, moonhound, was most active. The Egil's saga recounts the story of the hero's grandfather, Kveld Ulfr, Evening Wolf, a man who was known to be a shape-shifter, a hammermer, one who is strong in the hammer, and who became increasingly irritable and dangerous as the sun went down, a man whose wolf nature was a daily, cyclical burden that made him a terror to his neighbors and a danger to his own family. This story is a psychological portrait of a man who has been permanently altered by the wolf ritual, a man for whom the line between the human and the animal has become permanently blurred, and whose life is a constant, exhausting struggle to keep the wolf at bay. The Úlfhéðnar, as a class, were likely composed of such men, individuals whose psychological makeup, whether by innate disposition or by the trauma of the initiation, made them uniquely suited to the life of the sacred predator, and uniquely unsuited to the settled, agrarian peace of the Norse village, a tragic, heroic, and deeply frightening class of human beings who were the living, breathing legacy of the Odin cult. The relationship between the Úlfhéðnar and the Berserkers, the Bear Shirts, is one of the most debated and misunderstood aspects of the Norse warrior cults, and a careful examination of the sources reveals a complex, hierarchical, and theologically significant differentiation that was rooted in the distinct symbolic natures of the wolf and the bear in the Norse cosmos. The key text is the Haraldskvi of Orbjörn Hornklofi, a praise poem composed for King Harald Fairhair shortly after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, which is conventionally dated to around 872 CE, though the battle itself may have been a decade or so later. The poet, in a famously vivid stanza, describes the king's chosen warriors as they prepare for the final, decisive clash of the unification of Norway. The ship was crewed with nobles, the king's own men, the wolf skins they are called, who bear the bloody shields and redden the spears in the attack, They are the bravest of champions. The Berserkers, the bare shirts, they roared, the battle was upon them, the wolf skins howled, the iron weapons shook. This passage, which is one of the most precious and direct contemporary witnesses to the Viking warrior cults, makes three crucial distinctions. First, the Úlfhéðnar are mentioned first and are specifically identified as the king's own men, the inner circle of the royal bodyguard, while the Berserkers are a secondary, though still formidable, group. Second, the Úlfhéðnar are described as bearing bloody shields and reddening spears, a phrase that emphasizes their offensive, aggressive role, while the Berserkers roared, a more generalized, chaotic display of strength. Third, and most tellingly, the Úlfhéðnar are associated with the coordinated, tactical howling of the wolf pack, while the Berserkers are associated with the individual roar of the bear, a solitary, territorial animal. This poetic distinction reflects a real organizational difference. The wolf warriors fought as a coordinated unit, a pack that could be directed by the king to a specific point in the enemy line, while the bear warriors were often employed as individual champions, their role being to break the enemy's morale by a display of superhuman, solitary ferocity. The theological roots of this distinction lie in the different relationships that the wolf and the bear had with the god Odin. The wolf, as we have seen, is the animal of Odin's personal retinue, the Geri and Freki who sit at his feet in Valhalla and who feed on the flesh of the slain einherjar, a role that is intimate, permanent, and central to the god's own nature. The wolf is also, in the myth of Fenrir, the animal that will ultimately destroy Odin, a paradox that makes the wolf a symbol of both the god's power and his inevitable, apocalyptic doom, a deeply Odinic combination of glory and terror. The bear, by contrast, is a less centrally Odinic animal. It is associated with the god Thor in some contexts, as the enemy of the giants, and with the great bear of the sky, the constellation that the Norse called Karlsvagn, the Wain of the Man, but it does not have the same intimate, existential connection to the All-Father. The Berserker, by donning the bear skin, was channeling a more generalized, natural power of brute force, a strength that was impressive and useful but which was not as specifically sacred as the wolf's pack intelligence, and its direct link to the god of the gallows. This theological difference is reflected in the nomenclature. The Úlfinn is defined by the wolf, the specific animal of Odin, while the Berserker is defined by the Sirkr, the shirt, the garment of the bear, a term that is more generic and that was later extended, in a debased form, to any frenzied warrior, regardless of his animal affiliation. The wolf warriors, by their very name, were a more exclusive, theologically precise category, and their higher status in the Heraldskvi is a direct consequence of this closer identification with the chief of the gods. The tactical differences between the two cults, which the sources hint at but do not fully describe, are a matter of military logic and the ethology of the two animals. The wolf is a pack hunter, an animal that uses coordinated attacks, flanking maneuvers, and a system of vocal and body language signals to isolate and bring down prey that is much larger than an individual wolf. The Úlfhéðnar, by adopting the wolf as their model, were trained to operate as a team, Úlfaflokkr, wolf pack, that could be deployed by the chieftain as a shock unit to assault the most heavily defended section of the enemy shield wall, to exploit a gap, or to conduct a surprise night attack, a tactic that the Frankish chronicles record with horror. The bear, by contrast, is a solitary ambush predator, an animal of immense, explosive power but limited endurance and little tactical coordination. The Berserkers, accordingly, are often depicted in the sagas as fighting alone, challenging the enemy's champions to single combat, or acting as a roving, unpredictable force on the battlefield, a living siege engine that could break a shield wall by sheer, terrifying impact but which could not be relied upon to execute a complex plan. The Roman writer Tacitus, describing the Germanic comitatus in his Germania, notes that the bravest warriors fight in the front rank, and that the chieftain's personal companions form a tight, coordinated unit around him, a description that fits the Úlfhéðnar far better than the chaotic Berserkers. The wolf pack, in short, was a precision instrument. The bear was a blunt force trauma. A chieftain like Harald Fairhair, who was engaged in a complex campaign of territorial conquest that required the storming of fortified positions and the coordination of a fleet of longships, needed the precision of the wolves, and he rewarded them accordingly with the highest honors and the closest place at his side. The social status of the two cults within the warrior hierarchy of the Viking Age was, consequently, a matter of the type of chieftain they served and the strategic context of the campaign. The Úlfhéðnar were the elite of the royal here, the permanent bodyguard of the king, and their position was secured by a formal oath, the heir, which bound them to the king's person and granted them a share of the royal homingja. The Berserkers, by contrast, appear in the sagas as a more numerous, more widely distributed class of warriors, many of whom were freelance champions who hired themselves out to any chieftain who could afford their services, or who roamed the countryside in bands of 12, challenging the local farmers to duels and seizing their land, a practice that the Icelandic sagas record with a special loathing. The Eyrbyggja saga tells the story of two Swedish berserkers, Halli and Linur, who are brought to Iceland by a local chieftain and who proceed to terrorize the district with their violent, uncontrollable behavior, until the community unites to kill them in a specially prepared trap. This story, which is set in the 10th century, reflects the growing social problem of the freelance frenzied warrior, a problem that did not affect the Úlfhéðnar in the same way because the wolf cult was more tightly integrated into the royal household and, crucially, because the wolf's pack nature made the wolf warrior less prone to the solitary, antisocial violence of the bear. The wolf, the social predator, was a model of disciplined, hierarchical violence. The bear, the solitary predator, was a model of chaotic, individualistic aggression, and as the Viking Age wore on and the centralizing kings imposed their order on the free farmers, the bear had to be eradicated, while the wolf, for a time at least, could be kept on a leash. The ultimate fate of the two cults was, however, the same. Both were outlawed and exterminated by the Christian kings of the 11th and 12th centuries, a process that is recorded in the law codes and the sagas with a grim, final precision. The Gulathing Law of Norway, in its Christian redaction of the 11th century, contains a provision that a man who is found to be a berserker or an Úlfinn, and who causes a disturbance, is to be declared an outlaw, a skarmer, and any man may kill him without incurring a wergild. The Gragas of Iceland has a similar provision, and the Icelandic sagas of the Sturlunga period are filled with stories of the last, degraded remnants of the old warrior cults, now reduced to the status of bandits and outlaws, being hunted down and killed by the farmers they once terrorized. The Úlfhéðnar, the elite of Odin, the most sacred warriors of the north, ended their historical existence in the same way as the wild wolves of the forest, shot down with arrows, burned in their halls, and buried in unconsecrated ground, a tragic and ironic end for the men who had once been the foremost of the king's champions. The bear and the wolf, the sacred predators of the pagan age, had no place in the Christian, agrarian world of the medieval north, and their extermination was the final, decisive act of the long, slow revolution that transformed the Vikings from the wolves of the sea into the farmers of the fjord. The psychological warfare tactics of the Úlfhéðnar were not an incidental byproduct of their frenzy but a deliberately cultivated and systematically deployed arsenal of terror that was designed to unman the enemy before a single physical blow was landed, a form of pre-battle domination that was rooted in the deepest instincts of the human primate to fear the predator, the dark, and the supernatural. The first and most important weapon in this arsenal was the visual spectacle of the wolf warriors themselves. The carefully prepared pelts, the painted spiral symbols on the bare skin, the filed, pointed teeth, and the eyes, rolled back in the trance or fixed in a predatory stare, all combined to create a sight that was not merely frightening but fundamentally uncanny, a violation of the categories of human and animal, living and dead. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about the Germanic Harii tribe, a possible ancestor of the Úlfhéðnar cult, describes them as frightening with the shadows of the night, their shields blackened, their bodies painted, and they choose the darkest nights for their attacks, the fear of the ghostly army striking terror into their enemies, who cannot withstand the unaccustomed, almost infernal, sight. This passage, which dates from the 1st century CE, is a precise description of the psychological effect that the Úlfhéðnar were still producing 800 years later, a continuity of terror that speaks to the deep, archaic roots of the wolf cult's methods. The Frankish annals of the 9th century, such as the Annals of Saint Bertin, record with a shudder the arrival of the Northmen on the coasts of the Seine and the Loire, and the chroniclers frequently note that the raiders were not merely violent but that they seemed to be possessed by a diabolical fury, a phrase that is a Christian translation of the pagan R, and that the very sight of them was enough to cause the peasant levies to flee without striking a blow. The Úlfhéðnar, by their very presence, were a living argument for the superior, divine power of the Norse gods, a visible, audible, and terrifying demonstration that Odin was real and that his chosen warriors were beyond the reach of normal human courage. The auditory dimension of the wolf warrior's psychological warfare was equally important and equally terrifying. The howling of the pack, a sound that was designed to mimic the vocalizations of the wolf and to trigger the primal fear of the predator that is embedded in the human amygdala. The Haraldskvi specifically contrasts the howling of the Úlfhéðnar with the roaring of the Berserkers, and this distinction is tactically significant, for the howl of the wolf is a long-range, communicative signal that can be heard over great distances, a sound that coordinates the pack and intimidates the prey, while the roar of the bear is a close-range, confrontational display. The Úlfhéðnar, by howling in the misty dawn before an attack, were sending a complex, multi-layered message to the enemy. They were announcing their presence, they were demonstrating their non-human nature, they were coordinating their own movements, and they were, in the most literal sense, praying to Odin, the god whose name means the ecstatic, the furious, the god whose voice is the wind and the wolf's howl. The Anglo-Saxon poem The Battle of Maldon, which recounts a Viking victory over the English in 991 CE, does not mention the Úlfhéðnar by name, but it describes the heathen warriors as the slaughter wolves, a kenning that suggests the poet was aware of the wolf identity of the raiders, and the poem notes that the English were terrified by the war whoop of the heathens. The war whoop, the hurrah, was a collective, rhythmic shout that the Viking armies used to work themselves into a frenzy and to intimidate their opponents, a practice that is attested in many cultures but which, in the hands of the wolf pack, would have taken on an especially terrifying, animalistic quality, a human version of the wolf's chorus that signaled the imminent, coordinated slaughter. The use of the night, the darkness, and the liminal hours of dawn and dusk was a central component of the Úlfhéðnar's tactical repertoire, a strategy that was both practical and deeply symbolic, for the wolf is a crepuscular and nocturnal hunter, and the Odin cult was a cult of the gallows, the hanged dead, and the dark, hidden knowledge that is acquired in the shadow. The Herei, described by Tacitus, attacked on the darkest nights, and the Viking sagas are full of stories of surprise night attacks, the Natvig, night slaying, which were considered a legitimate and particularly effective form of warfare, especially when conducted by the wolf-skinned elite. A 9th century Viking raid on the city of Nantes in 843 CE, recorded in the Frankish annals, was launched at dawn on the feast of St. John, when the city was crowded with pilgrims and the gates were open, a brilliantly timed assault that sowed a panic so complete that the defenders were unable to organize any effective resistance. The Úlfhéðnar, moving in the grey half-light, would have been virtually invisible until they were upon the enemy, their wolf skins blending with the shadows, their eyes, perhaps daubed with a reflective substance, catching the light of the watchfires in a terrifying, animal gleam. The psychological effect of such an attack on a sentry, half asleep and already fearful of the dark, can only be imagined. The sudden, silent emergence of a pack of man-wolves from the mist, the first, choked cry of alarm, and then the howling, the shield biting, the spears reddening in the first light of the dawn, a scene that was a deliberate, ritualized recreation of the myth of the wild hunt, the Oscorii. The ride of Odin and his dead warriors across the winter sky, a divine, nocturnal terror made flesh and blood and steel. The pre-battle rituals of the Úlfhéðnar, which were conducted in full view of the enemy whenever possible, were a form of psychological dominance that was intended to demonstrate the invulnerability and the divine favor of the wolf pack, a performance of power that was as important as the physical combat itself. The shield biting, the skjaldarbit, was the most famous of these rituals, a display of such intense, frenzied aggression that the warrior gnawed at the iron rim of his shield until the metal buckled and his gums bled, a self-mutilation that signaled to the enemy that the Úlfhéðnar were beyond pain, beyond fear, and beyond reason. The Byzantine historian John Skylitzes, writing in the late 11th century, describes the Varangian Guard at the Battle of Silistra in 971 CE as rushing upon the enemy with a mad fury, biting their shields, and howling like wild beasts. A description that confirms the survival of the skaldarbit ritual among the professional Norse warriors of the Byzantine army, and its continued use as a weapon of psychological terror. The Úlfhéðnar also employed a ritual dance, the dawn, a term that may be related to the Old Norse word for the trance-state itself, in which the warriors moved in a slow, stamping circle, their spears clashing rhythmically against their shields, their voices rising and falling in a wordless, guttural chant, a performance that was designed to induce a collective, synchronized trance and to project an aura of inexorable, supernatural power. The Torslunda helmet plate, with its dancing, wolf-skin figure, is a visual record of this ritual, a moment of sacred theater that was as much a part of the wolf warrior's arsenal as his spear and his axe. The enemy who watched this performance, shivering in his shield wall, would have understood that he was not facing mere men but the chosen of a god, and the battle was already half lost before the first charge was sounded. The ultimate aim of the Úlfhéðnar's psychological warfare was to induce a state of collective panic, the herflygja, army flight, a catastrophic breakdown of the enemy's morale that would allow the wolf pack to rout an opposing force many times its size without the need for a prolonged, grinding battle. The Frankish and Anglo-Saxon chronicles are filled with accounts of battles in which the Viking army, though outnumbered, was able to shatter the defending force because the shield wall disintegrated at the first sight of the wolf-skin champions, the men throwing down their weapons and fleeing into the countryside, where they were ridden down and slaughtered by the pursuing wolves. The Battle of Ashdown in 871 C, where King Alfred of Wessex defeated a Viking army under Bagsec and Halfdan, was a rare example of a successful Anglo-Saxon resistance to the Vikings' psychological assault, and the chronicler notes that Alfred, a man of exceptional fortitude, was able to hold his shield wall together against the heathen fury. By his personal example and by his prayers to the Christian God. The normal response, however, was the one recorded by the monk Abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in his account of the siege of Paris in 885-886 CE. The defenders, seeing the Northmen, raging with a fury that was not human, and biting their shields in their madness, were seized with a great fear, and many despaired of their lives. The Úlfhéðnar, by their mastery of the psychology of fear, had created a weapon that could win battles without a single swing of the axe, a weapon that turned the enemy's own mind against him, and that made the wolf pack, for a brief, glorious century, the unchallenged masters of the battlefield. The tactical deployment of the Úlfhéðnar in the Viking battle order was a highly specialized and carefully coordinated affair, a sharp departure from the conventional image of the shield wall as a static, defensive formation, and a reflection of the wolf pack's unique ability to function as a mobile, offensive shock unit. The Old Norse sources, particularly the skaldic poems, often describe the Úlfhéðnar as forming the Svinfálking, the swine array, the wedge-shaped formation that was the signature assault tactic of the Viking Age, a human battering ram designed to punch through the enemy's line at a single, decisive point. The Roman writer Vigetius, whose military manual De Re Militari was widely read in the medieval period, describes the wedge formation as a tactic of the barbarians, and the Viking adaptation of this formation, with the Úlfhéðnar at the apex of the wedge, was a terrifying refinement that concentrated the wolf pack's frenzied power on a narrow front. The Hrafnsmál states that Harald Fairhair's wolf coats bore no shields in the battle, a detail that has puzzled many readers, for the shield was the essential defensive equipment of the Viking warrior. The solution to this puzzle is that the Úlfhéðnar, at the tip of the wedge, were expected to use their bodies as living rams, their frenzy-induced insensibility to pain allowing them to crash into the enemy's shields with a reckless, suicidal abandon that would shatter the opposing line and create a breach for the more conventionally armed warriors behind them. The wolf warriors, in this tactical role, were not merely soldiers. They were human ordnance, guided missiles of flesh and fury, and their function was to sacrifice themselves, if necessary, to break the enemy's formation, a role that required a degree of religious fanaticism and psychological conditioning that was the exclusive product of the Odin cult. The coordination of the Úlfhéðnar's attack within the swine array was a matter of precise timing and non-verbal communication, skills that were likely developed through a system of training that the sagas only hint at. The wolf pack, as we have noted, fought as a unit, and the unit's effectiveness depended on the ability of its members to read each other's movements, to respond instantly to the alpha wolf, and to exploit the gaps in the enemy's defense with a coordinated, simultaneous lunge. The howl, the wolf's cry, was the primary signal, a long, rising note that could carry over the din of battle and that communicated, in a single, piercing sound, the moment of the charge. The sagas also hint at the use of a system of spear signals, a kind of semaphore in which the alpha wolf, the Varangi, would use the movement of his spear to direct the pack to the left or the right, a technique that would have been especially useful in the chaos of a broken shield wall, when the noise was too great for any voice to be heard. The remarkable discipline of the wolf pack, their ability to maintain a coordinated attack even in the grip of the R, is a testament to the depth of their training and to the strength of the social bond that the initiation ritual had forged between them. The wolf, after all, is a social animal, and the pack's strength lies in its cohesion, its ability to function as a single, multi-bodied organism, a super predator whose collective intelligence is greater than the sum of its individual parts. The Úlfhéðnar, by modeling their tactics on the wolf, had achieved a level of small unit cohesion that was unmatched in the medieval battlefield, a cohesion that was spiritual, emotional, and physical all at once, and that made the wolf pack the most feared assault formation of the age. The use of the Úlfhéðnar in the defense of the chieftain's person, as a living, sacred bodyguard, was a second, equally important tactical role, and it was one that drew on the wolf's instinct to protect the pack leader, the alpha male and female, with a ferocious, self-sacrificing loyalty. The Hrafnsmál explicitly states that the wolf coats were the king's own men, and the sagas are filled with stories of the Hare, the personal bodyguard, fighting to the death around the fallen body of their lord, a behavior that was not merely a matter of feudal honor but a sacred duty, an obligation that was encoded in the oath of the heir and enforced by the fear of Odin's wrath. The Battle of Maldon, in 991 C, though a defeat for the English, provides a famous example of this bodyguard ethic. The Anglo-Saxon warriors, the Heer-Wered, Hearth Troop, fought to the last man around the body of their fallen alderman Bertnath, and the Old English poem that commemorates the battle is a celebration of their suicidal, sacred loyalty. The Úlfhéðnar, as the elite of the Norse here, were the practitioners of the same ethos, and their presence at the king's side was both a practical military asset and a powerful symbol of his Odinic legitimacy, a visible, snarling guarantee that the king was under the protection of the All-Father's wolves. The chieftain who could command such a bodyguard was, in the eyes of his followers, a true níðingr, a king by divine favor, and his ability to attract and retain the wolf pack was a crucial component of his political and military power. The Úlfhéðnar, in this role, were not just a weapon, they were a crown, a living regalia that proclaimed the chieftain's status as the earthly representative of the god of the gallows. The tactical limitations of the Úlfhéðnar, the weaknesses that were inherent in their mode of warfare, are as important to understand as their strengths, for these limitations would ultimately contribute to their decline and disappearance. The first and most obvious weakness was the inability of the wolf warriors to sustain their frenzy for a prolonged period, a physiological reality that the sources acknowledge. The Ynglinga saga notes that the Berserkers would last only as long as the battle, and that afterwards the warriors would be as weak as infants, a state of total exhaustion that left them vulnerable to a counterattack. The Úlfhéðnar, once the frenzy had worn off, were essentially incapacitated, unable to defend themselves or to pursue a fleeing enemy, a fact that made their deployment a calculated gamble. The pack had to break the enemy's line quickly, or it would be left exhausted and exposed. The second weakness was the wolf warriors' vulnerability to missile weapons, a vulnerability that their lack of shields and armor, which was a source of their psychological terror, also made a fatal tactical liability. A disciplined enemy who could hold his ground and pour a volley of arrows or javelins into the charging wolf pack could inflict heavy casualties before the frenzy took full effect, a tactic that the Byzantine armies, with their superior missile troops, used to great effect against the Varangian Guard on several occasions. The third weakness was the wolf warrior's inability to function in the complex, combined arms warfare of the later medieval period, when the mounted knight and the crossbowman had rendered the naked, frenzied charge a suicidal anachronism. The Úlfhéðnar were a weapon of the shield wall age, and their day was the day of the longship and the summer raid, a day that was passing by the late 10th century, leaving the wolf pack without a battlefield to hunt. The ultimate tactical legacy of the Úlfhéðnar was not their specific formations or their assault techniques but their contribution to the Viking Elan, the culture of aggressive, fearless, and individually audacious warfare that was the hallmark of the Scandinavian expansion and that left a permanent mark on the military traditions of Europe. The Normans, the descendants of the Vikings who settled in France, were famous for their impetuous, shock-based cavalry tactics, a style of warfare that was the mounted, armored, Christianized descendant of the wolf pack's charge. The Varangian Guard, the Norse mercenaries of the Byzantine emperors, preserved the memory of the Úlfhéðnar in their famous battle fury and their use of the double-handed axe, a weapon that was designed to shatter shields and armor with a single, devastating stroke, a physical manifestation of the wolf warrior's single-minded, frenzied assault. The Úlfhéðnar themselves faded from the battlefield, but the spirit of the wolf, the sacred, divine madness that Odin poured into his chosen, continued to howl in the blood of the northern peoples, a permanent, psychological inheritance that would echo down the centuries, from the Norman knights who charged at Hastings to the Scottish Highlanders who charged at Culloden, a long, unbroken lineage of the sacred predator. The wolf in human skin, the servant of the hanged god. The shamanic dimension of the Úlfhéðnar cult is the key to understanding the deepest, most mysterious aspect of these warriors, their claim to be able to leave their bodies in the form of a wolf, to travel through the spirit world, and to influence events at a distance, a practice that is known in the Old Norse sources as Hamfarir, the soul journey. The concept of the hammer, the shaped soul, is central to Norse psychology and metaphysics. Every human being possessed a hammer, an inner, animal-shaped double that could, under certain conditions, detach itself from the physical body and journey independently, while the body lay in a trance, a state that was called Hamfar or Hamlipa. The Úlfhéðnar, by their intense, prolonged identification with the wolf, were believed to have developed a particularly strong, wolf-shaped hammer, a spirit wolf that could be sent forth to scout the enemy's camp, to attack the enemy's livestock, or to engage in spirit combat with the hammer of an opposing shaman. The Volsunga Saga's account of Sigmund and St. Jotli, in which the donning of the wolf skin causes an involuntary, physical transformation into a wolf, is a mythic, exaggerated version of this belief. The Hamfarir was not a literal, bodily transformation but a spiritual one, a trance state in which the warrior's consciousness, his on-breath soul, was projected into the wolf hammer and sent out into the world. The sagas are filled with stories of such spirit journeys. In the Vstra saga, the outlaw warrior Orger Haverson is said to have the ability to send out his hammer in the shape of a bear or a wolf to terrify his enemies, and the saga notes, with a chilling matter-of-factness, that his body would lie as if dead, while his spirit wolf roamed the hills, a description that is a textbook account of a shamanic trance. The practical military application of the Hamfarir was, in the eyes of the Norse, a form of supernatural reconnaissance, a way of obtaining information about the enemy's position, strength, and intentions that was beyond the reach of normal human scouts. The Ynglinga saga states that Odin himself could change his shape, then his body lay as if it was asleep or dead, but he was a bird or a wild beast, a fish or a serpent, and went in an instant to distant lands, on his own errands or those of other men. The Úlfhéðnar, as the servants of Odin, were believed to possess a portion of this divine ability, and the chieftain who had a wolf warrior in his retinue was, in a sense, in possession of a living, supernatural intelligence asset, a weapon that could penetrate the enemy's lines without risk of detection. The Byzantine sources on the Varangian Guard contain hints of this belief. The general and historian Michael Italiates, writing in the 11th century, records that the Norse warriors of the emperor were known to fall into a deep, death-like sleep before a battle, and that they would awake with precise knowledge of the enemy's dispositions, a phenomenon that he attributes to a demonic power, which the pagans call a vision. This is a Christian, hostile account of the Hamfarir, a practice that was, to the Byzantine observer, a diabolical sorcery, but which, to the Varangian himself, was a normal, expected function of the Odin cult. The Úlfhéðnar, by their mastery of the trance, were not merely warriors. They were the eyes of Odin in the field, the invisible, wolf-shaped spies that prowled the darkness and brought back the secrets of the enemy, a tactical advantage that was as terrifying as it was, to the believers, real. The ritual induction of the Hamfarir trance was a complex procedure that involved the isolation of the warrior, the rhythmic chanting of the pack, and very possibly, the use of psychoactive substances that were known to the Norse and their Sami neighbors. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, with its distinctive red cap flecked with white, has a long and well-documented history of shamanic use among the circumpolar peoples, including the Sami Noidi, who consumed it to induce a trance of flying, of spirit journeying to the other world. The mushroom's effects, which include a sensation of flying, a distortion of the sense of size and distance, and a profound dissociative state, are remarkably consistent with the descriptions of the Hamfarir in the sagas, and it is very likely that the Úlfhéðnar, who were in close contact with the Sami and who shared many of their shamanic techniques, made use of this or a similar substance. The Havamal, the poem of Odin's wisdom, contains a mysterious stanza that may refer to such a practice. I know a 16th spell. If I want to win a wise woman's love, I change the mind of the white-armed woman, and I turn her whole desire to me. The changing of the mind is a phrase that is often used in the sagas to describe the effects of the trance, and the 16th spell is one of the magical charms that Odin, the ultimate shaman, teaches to the initiated. The Úlfhéðnar, by ingesting the sacred mushroom and entering the trance, were not taking a recreational drug. They were participating in a holy communion, a sharing of the body of the god, a ritual that dissolved the boundaries of the self and allowed the wolf spirit within to break free and run, howling, into the darkness, a practice that was the ultimate, secret source of their power and their terror. The relationship between the Úlfhéðnar and the Sami shamanic tradition is a matter of growing scholarly interest, and the evidence for a deep, sustained cultural exchange between the two groups is increasingly strong. The Sami, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, were renowned throughout the Viking world for their magical powers, their ability to control the weather, to heal the sick, and to journey in the spirit world, and the Norse sagas are full of references to the Sami Noidi and their dangerous, potent sorcery. The Vatsdala saga tells the story of a Norse chieftain who hires a Sami shaman to perform a spirit journey to Iceland to scout out a new land for settlement, a task that the shaman accomplishes by entering a trance and sending his hammer in the shape of a whale, a remarkable, detailed account of the practice of Hamfarir by a Sami practitioner. The Úlfhéðnar, who operated in the same geographical and cultural space as the Sami, and who were engaged in a similar, shamanic form of warrior spirituality, would have been the natural partners and pupils of the Sami Noidi, and it is very likely that the wolf cult's techniques of trance induction, its use of the pelt as a tool of transformation, and its belief in the spirit journey were all heavily influenced by the older, more established shamanic tradition of the circumpolar north. The wolf, in Sami mythology, is a powerful, dangerous spirit, a creature of the dark in the winter, and the Sami Noidi were known to be able to take the form of the wolf in their trance journeys, a parallel that is too close to be a coincidence. The Úlfhéðnar, in this reading, were the southern, Germanic, Odin-worshipping branch of a vast, pan-Arctic complex of wolf shamanism, a cult that stretched from the Norse fjords to the Siberian taiga, a brotherhood of the predator that was united by a common, terrifying vision of the divine as a force of uncontainable, lupine destruction. The demise of the Hamfarir tradition, and with it the shamanic core of the Úlfhéðnar cult, was a direct consequence of the Christianization of Scandinavia, a process that began in the 10th century and was largely complete by the end of the 11th. The Christian Church, with its absolute distinction between the human soul and the animal, its condemnation of magic as the work of the devil, and its horror at the idea of a human being possessed by an animal spirit, declared war on the old shamanic practices with a relentless, systematic fury. The law codes of the Christian kings, such as the Gulathing law in its Christian redaction, explicitly outlawed the Hamfarir as a form of said, the old custom, and the penalty for practicing the soul journey was the same as that for the practice of the seer, the shamanic magic, full outlawry, the status of the skarmer, the wolf in the forest, a man who could be killed by anyone without fear of legal consequence. The Úlfhéðnar, the old masters of the hammer, were thus hunted down and executed by the very society they had once protected, their sacred, wolf-shaped souls condemned as demons, their trances reinterpreted as diabolical possessions, their god, Odin, the lord of the gallows, transformed into a devil, a figure of pure, satanic evil. The last of the spirit wolves died, unwept, on the gallows of the Christian kings, and the knowledge of the Hamfarir, the secret of the wolf soul, was lost, buried in the unconsecrated graves of the outlawed and the damned, a final, tragic skifting of the sacred into the profane, a transformation that marked the true end of the Viking Age. The relationship between Úlfhéðnar and the god Odin was not a distant, abstract devotion but an intimate, daily, and physically enacted bond, a fulgia connection in which the god's spirit, his ar, was believed to reside within the warrior's body, transforming him into a living, breathing avatar of the hanged god. The Old Norse language itself encodes this intimacy in the very name of the god, in the ecstatic one, the furious one, the master of Ar, the divine frenzy that was the essential substance of the wolf warrior's battle trance. The Úlfhéðnar, by entering the Úlfhéðnar, were not merely worshipping Odin. They were becoming Odin, or rather, they were becoming the god's earthly hammer, his wolf-shaped soul projection into the world of Midgard, the realm of men. The theological foundation for this belief is the myth of Odin's hanging on the world tree Yggdrasil, a self-sacrifice that is described in the Havamal as a shamanic initiation. I know that I hung on a windy tree for 9 full nights, wounded by a spear and given to Odin, myself to myself. The god, by hanging himself, dies to his own humanity and is reborn as the master of the runes, the magic of the cosmos, a transformation that is the template for the wolf warrior's initiation. The Úlfhéðnar, by their ritual hanging, a practice that is hinted at in the sources and that is iconographically represented in the many Viking Age amulets of the hanged man, were reenacting this divine self-sacrifice, a symbolic death that opened the gate to the wolf's power and to the direct, personal possession by the god. The wolf warrior, on the battlefield, was Odin on earth, the god's hunger for the dead made flesh, a sacred predator whose every kill was a sacrifice to the divine, a prayer of the spear and the severed limb, a liturgy of the blood that was the highest form of Norse worship. The iconography of Odin in the Viking Age, the visual culture of the god that has survived in the form of amulets, helmet plates, rune stones, and picture stones, is saturated with the imagery of the wolf and the hangman, a complex of symbols that was the visual language of the Úlfhéðnar cult. The Torslunda helmet plates, with their dancing wolf warrior, are one of the earliest and most important examples of this iconography. But they are far from the only one. The 8th century picture stone from Lilbjars on the island of Gotland depicts a warrior hanging from a tree, surrounded by a pack of wolves, a scene that is clearly a representation of the Odin cult's sacrificial ritual, a human offering to the wolves of the god. The famous Osberg tapestry, discovered in the royal ship burial of 834 C in Vestfold, Norway, is a vast, narrative textile that depicts a procession of warriors, some of whom are wearing animal skins and carrying spears, a possible representation of the Úlfhéðnar in the service of the Osberg queen, a visual confirmation that the wolf cult was a feature of the highest levels of Viking society. The numerous small amulets of the weapon dancer, a figure brandishing a spear and sword, which have been found across Scandinavia and the Viking colonies, are often interpreted as images of Odin in his aspect as the god of the Berserkers, and the frequent association of these figures with wolf motifs strengthens the identification. The Christian reaction to this iconography, the systematic destruction of the pagan images and the reinterpretation of the wolf as a symbol of the devil, is a backhanded testament to the power of the old symbols. The Church recognized, with a horror that was as theological as it was visceral, that the image of the wolf warrior was a direct, potent threat to the Christian message of the Lamb of God, the sacrifice that had ended all sacrifices, and it moved, with the full force of the law and the sword to eradicate it. The specific rituals of the Odin cult that the Úlfhéðnar performed are only faintly and fragmentarily preserved in the texts, but enough survives to reconstruct a probable outline of the sacrificial cycle that bound the wolf pack to the god. The blot, the blood sacrifice, was the central act of the Norse religion, and the Úlfhéðnar, as the priests of Odin, were the performers of a particular, especially grim form of the blot, the man blot, the human sacrifice, in which the enemy captives were offered to the god by hanging and by the ritual wounding with the spear, the gearsad, the point of the spear that was the mark of Odin. The 11th century chronicler Adam of Bremen, in his Gesta Hammerbergensis Ecclesiae Pontificum, provides a horrifying, detailed account of a great pagan festival at the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden, where 9 males of every living creature are sacrificed and hung in a sacred grove, and where the howling of the wolves is a constant, eerie soundtrack to the rites. Adam does not specifically mention the Úlfhéðnar, but the Uppsala temple was a center of the Odin cult, and the hanging of the victims, the presence of the wolves, and the atmosphere of terror and ecstasy that he describes are all consistent with the known practices of the wolf warriors. The Úlfhéðnar, after a battle, would have presided over the vow fall, the chooser of the slain, the ritual in which the dead enemies were dedicated to Odin by the cutting of the vokna, the knot of the slain, a symbol of 3 interlocking triangles that is found on the cremation urns of the Vendel period and on the rune stones of the Viking Age, a sign that the dead man was now the property of the god. The wolf warrior, by this act, was claiming the enemy's soul for Odin, sending it to Valhalla as a recruit for the Einherjar, the army of the dead that will fight at Ragnarok, a sacred harvest that was the ultimate purpose of the raid and the ultimate justification for the carnage. The relationship between the Úlfhéðnar and the other major gods of the Norse pantheon, particularly Thor and Freyr, was one of complementary opposition, a division of sacred labor that reflected the different, specialized functions of the warrior cults. Thor, the red-bearded god of thunder, was the champion of the farmers and the free men, the enemy of the giants and the protector of Midgard, and his cult was the religion of the settled, agricultural community, a faith of law, order, and the defense of the homestead. The Úlfhéðnar, by contrast, were the servants of Odin, the god of the gallows and the wild, the patron of outlaws, poets, and the wandering, chaotic violence of the raid. The Havamal, the poem of Odin's wisdom, contains many stanzas that contrast the cautious, prudent, hearth-bound life of the farmer with the bold, reckless, and glorious life of the wanderer, the Vikingr, a contrast that is a theological statement of the essential, irreconcilable difference between the two cults. The Úlfhéðnar, in their wolf frenzy, were a living embodiment of the Odin side of this equation, a force of creative destruction that was necessary for the acquisition of wealth and the expansion of the territory, but which was fundamentally incompatible with the settled, agrarian life that the Thor cult sustained. The tension between these two religious poles, the farmer and the wolf, the law and the frenzy, the hammer and the spear, is one of the deep, structural dynamics of the Viking Age, a tension that was held in a precarious balance during the raiding centuries but which, with the coming of Christianity and the consolidation of the royal state, tipped decisively in favor of Thor and the farmers, leaving the wolves of Odin without a place in the new, Christian, and ordered world. The ultimate fate of the Odin cult, of which the Úlfhéðnar were the most extreme and visible expression, was its gradual, violent suppression by the Christian kings and missionaries, a process that is recorded in the sagas as a series of dramatic confrontations, temple burnings, and martyrdom. The Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson, the great cycle of the sagas of the Norwegian kings, is a narrative of the Christianization of Norway, and it is filled with stories of the old pagan warriors, the Berserker and Úlfhéðnar, who refused to abandon their god and who are, one by one, hunted down and killed by the agents of the Christian king, the saintly Olaf Haraldsson. The saga recounts that Olaf, during his campaign to Christianize the Trondelag in the 1020s, encountered a group of Úlfhéðnar who had sworn an oath to Odin to resist the new religion to the death, and the king, after defeating them in a pitched battle, had them executed in a mass hanging, a deliberate, ironic reversal of the Odin cult's own sacrificial ritual, a blot of the wolves to the new, Christian god. The portable scales of the Silframar, the ring-breakers' hordes, the dragon ships, and the wolf pelts were all swept away by the same tide of conversion and state formation, a great, historical skifting that divided the old, pagan North from the new, Christian Scandinavia, and that left the Úlfhéðnar, the sacred predators of the hanged god, as ghosts in the sagas, howling in the dark of the long, Christian winter. A memory of a world that had been, in the words of the skald, given to the wolves. The archaeological evidence for the existence and the rituals of the Úlfhéðnar is, by its very nature, fragmentary and ambiguous, for the organic materials of the pelts and the wood of the ritual sites have long since decayed into the acidic soil of the north, but the surviving metalwork, the iconography, and the forensic analysis of the graves have provided a series of tantalizing clues that, when pieced together, confirm the reality of the wolf cult and shed a stark, physical light on its practices. The Torslunda helmet plate dies, which we have already discussed at length, remain the single most important piece of evidence, a primary source in bronze that was produced in the Vendel period, around the 7th century, and that was discovered in a smith's hoard on the island of Öland in 1870. The plates, which are now in the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm, are a set of 4 bronze patricias, the master dies from which the decorated foil panels of ceremonial helmets were stamped, and they depict a series of ritual scenes that are demonstrably Odinic. The figure of the wolf-skinned warrior, brandishing a spear in a dance, is unmistakable, and the juxtaposition of this figure with the bear-skinned warrior confirms the existence of a differentiated animal warrior cult that predates the Viking Age by at least a century. The fact that these dies were found in a smith's hoard, a cache of valuable metal that was buried and never recovered, suggests that the smith was a specialist who produced the iconography of the warrior cult for a clientele of chieftains, a man whose craft was the material, physical medium of the Odin religion, and whose work was a form of sacred art that turned a simple iron helmet in the graves of the Viking Age, when subjected to modern forensic analysis, have yielded a second, more personal kind of evidence, the bodies of the warriors themselves, their bones telling the story of a life of extreme, ritualized violence that is consistent with the known practices of the Úlfhéðnar. The skeleton of a warrior from a 10th century grave in the island of Jorko, the site of the great trading town of Birka, was found with his teeth filed into sharp, predatory points, a form of body modification that is extremely rare in the Viking world and that is interpreted by many archaeologists as a mark of the wolf cult, a permanent, physical transformation of the human into the predator. The same grave contained a set of gaming pieces, a sword, and the remains of a sacrificed horse, a rich assemblage that suggests the man was a warrior of high status, a member of the chieftain's here, and his filed teeth, which would have been a terrifying sight in life, are a direct, physical confirmation of the saga's descriptions of the wolf grin of the Úlfhéðnar. The mass grave at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, the execution site of the 51 decapitated Vikings that we have already discussed, contained several individuals whose skeletons showed the characteristic, repeated, non-fatal trauma of the professional warrior, including healed sword cuts to the face and the forearms, wounds that were sustained in close-quarters combat, and one individual whose teeth were filed in the same manner as the Birka warrior, a man who was likely an Úlfinn, executed as an outlaw, his body dumped in a pit with the mark of the wolf still on his skull. These forensic discoveries, which are the result of the careful, scientific sifting of the archaeological record, are the closest we will ever come to a direct, personal encounter with the wolf warriors, a silent, bone-white testimony to the reality of the cult. The animal bones that are found in the ritual sites and the graves of the Viking Age provide a third, indirect but powerful line of evidence for the wolf cult, a line that is written in the zoological record of the sacrifices. The Great Hall of the Chieftain at the site of Lidre in Denmark, a royal center of the late Iron Age and the Viking period, was surrounded by a series of ritual deposits that included the skulls and the long bones of a large number of dogs and wolves, animals that were clearly not consumed for food but were sacrificed, decapitated, and buried in a deliberate, structured pattern around the hall. The archaeologists have interpreted these deposits as the remains of the blot, the seasonal sacrifices that were offered to Odin and to the protective spirits of the hall, and the presence of the wolf bones, in particular, is a strong indication that the wolf was a sacred animal at Lidre, a totem of the ruling dynasty and a focus of the cult. The site of the Viking Age fortress of Trelleborg in Denmark, one of the great ring fortresses of King Harald Bluetooth, has yielded a similar deposit of sacrificed wolves, a sign that the wolf cult was an official, state-sponsored religion that was integrated into the military infrastructure of the kingdom. The wolf, in these ritual contexts, was not a pest to be exterminated but a divine messenger to be honored, a sacred predator whose body was a vessel of the god's power, and the men who wore the skins of these sacrificed wolves were the living, human vessels of the same sacred force, a continuum of the divine that stretched from the animal to the man to the god, a holy, bloody chain of being that was the essence of the Odin cult. The iconography of the wolf on the rune stones and the picture stones of the Viking Age provides a fourth, and perhaps the most accessible, line of evidence, a public, monumental art that was erected in the landscape for all to see and that frequently depicts the wolf as a central, sacred symbol. The rune stone of Torslunda in Skane, Sweden, raised in the 11th century, depicts a large, stylized wolf running alongside a ship, a scene that is interpreted as the ship of the dead sailing to Valhalla, escorted by the wolves of Odin, a visual prayer for the safe passage of the dead man's soul to the hall of the god. The rune stone of Lagno in Södermanland, Sweden, bears an inscription that reads, Harald raised this stone in memory of his son, who was an elfin of the king. A direct, contemporary, lapidary mention of the wolf warrior, a text that confirms the existence of the cult and its high status in the 11th century, just before the final triumph of Christianity. The picture stones of Gotland, those unique, narrative monuments that depict the myths and the legends of the Norse world, frequently show the figure of Odin riding his 8-legged horse Sleipnir, accompanied by his 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, a scene that was the central icon of the cult, the image of the divine pack, and that was, for the Úlfhéðnar, the mirror of their own, earthly pack, the human wolves who followed the chieftain, the earthly Odin, into battle. The rune stones, which were erected by the families of the dead to mark their graves and to proclaim their status, are the public, permanent record of the wolf cult, a record that the Church, in its later campaign of destruction, could not entirely erase, and they stand still in the fields and the churchyards of Scandinavia, as silent, stone witnesses to the age of the wolf. The future of the archaeology of the Úlfhéðnar, as the techniques of ADN, isotope analysis, and proteomics are applied to the skeletal remains and the organic residues of the Viking Age, is likely to revolutionize our understanding of the wolf cult, and perhaps to provide the first direct, molecular evidence of the rituals of the Hamfarir. The ADN analysis of the wolf bones from the sacrificial deposits may reveal that the sacrificed animals were not local, wild wolves but were specially bred, possibly even imported, for the ritual, a domesticated, sacred line of wolves that were the totems of the chieftain's family, a material, genetic link between the human pack and the animal pack. The isotope analysis of the teeth of the warriors with the filed teeth may reveal that they were not native to the region where they were buried but were migrants, wanderers who had been initiated into the wolf cult in a distant land and who had come to the chieftain's hall to offer their services, a diaspora of the sacred predator. The proteomic analysis of the soil residues in the ritual sites may, in the near future, be able to detect the specific proteins of the wolf skin, a chemical fingerprint of the pelts that have long since decayed, a direct, material confirmation that the wolf skins were actually present in the sacred spaces of the cult. The archaeology of the Úlfhéðnar is an open, ongoing excavation, a slow, patient sifting of the soil that is, in its own way, a continuation of the work of the Silframar, a careful, methodical weighing of the evidence, a search for the just weight of the truth, a final, modern audit of the wolf cult that will, one day, allow the Úlfhéðnar to howl once more. Not in the terror of the raid but in the clarity of the scientific record, a resurrection of the sacred predator in the light of the 21st century. The psychological profile of the Úlfhéðnar, as we can reconstruct it from the saga accounts and the forensic evidence, was a complex, volatile, and often tragic combination of extreme aggression, deep group loyalty, and a profound, culturally induced dissociative disorder that made the wolf warrior both a supremely effective soldier and a deeply dysfunctional human being. The modern psychiatric concept of the Berserkers, when analyzed by clinicians who have studied the phenomenon, is often compared to the acute stress response, the hysterical frenzy, and the dissociative trance that are observed in certain cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and in the culturally specific syndromes of the running amok type. The Úlfhéðnar, by their prolonged, extreme training and their initiation rituals, had essentially conditioned themselves to enter a state of auto-hypnotic, self-induced psychosis on the battlefield, a state in which the normal inhibitions of the human psyche, the fear of death, the aversion to killing, the sense of personal identity, were temporarily suspended, and the warrior became a pure, unreflective engine of destruction. the Ynglinga saga's description of the Berserkers as a state in which the warrior is as strong as a bear or a bull, and slays men, but neither fire nor iron can harm him, is a precise, phenomenological account of this dissociative state, a state in which the perception of pain is completely suppressed, the body's normal strength limits are overridden by a flood of adrenaline and endorphins, and the warrior's consciousness is narrowed to a single, predatory focus. The Úlfhéðnar, in this state, were not mad in the sense of being irrational. They were hyper-rational, their minds operating at a primal, instinctual level that was perfectly adapted to the chaos of the shield wall, a consciousness that was that of the wolf, not the man. The long-term psychological effects of this conditioned dissociation on the individual warrior were, however, devastating, and the sagas are filled with accounts of the berserker or the lupine who, in times of peace, was unable to control his rages, a man who became a danger to his own family and community, and who was eventually exiled or killed. The Egil saga's portrait of Kveldulfr, the evening wolf, is a case study in this psychological deterioration. Kveldulfr, a chieftain of the 9th century, is described as a man who was very strong and a great warrior, but who became so bad-tempered in the evening that few people dared to speak to him, and he was called a shape-shifter. The saga notes that Kveldulfr's rages were involuntary, a curse that was linked to the setting of the sun, the time when the wolf, the níðingr, was most active, and that he eventually withdrew from society to live in a remote farm, a self-imposed exile that was the only way he could prevent himself from harming his own kin. This is a clinical description of a man suffering from a severe, chronic dissociative disorder, a disorder that was likely caused by the repeated, extreme activation of the Úlfhéðnar over a lifetime of warfare, a condition that the Norse themselves recognized and feared, and that they attributed to the possession by the wolf spirit. The wolf, in this context, was not merely a symbol of power, it was a psychic parasite, a spirit that, once invited into the body through the initiation ritual, could not be expelled, and that would eventually consume the human host, leaving only a predator in human skin, a monster that had to be destroyed. The social psychology of the Úlfhéðnar, their group dynamics, was the counterbalance to this individual psychological disintegration, a system of mutual support and control that bound the wolf pack together and channeled their destructive energies towards the enemy. The wolf pack was a felag in the deepest sense, a partnership of shared danger and shared reward, and the bond between the felagar was reinforced by the oath, the heir, that had been sworn on the sacred ring, an oath that was guaranteed by Odin and that could not be broken without incurring the most terrible, supernatural consequences. The pack provided the individual wolf warrior with a stable, external identity, alpha flocker that was his true, social self, a replacement for the human et that he had partially renounced. The pack's alpha, the Varangi, was the chieftain, the earthly Odin, and his role was not only to lead the pack in battle but to manage the internal tensions, to mediate the disputes, and to ensure that the Jafnir, the fair division of the spoils, was maintained, a function that was as essential for the psychological stability of the pack as it was for its economic survival. The ritual of the skifting, the division of the plunder, was, for the Úlfhéðnar, a psychological ritual of rehumanization, a process by which the predators, after the frenzy of the battle, were reintegrated into the social order of the war band, their animal rage soothed by the fair, measured weight of the silver, a balancing of the scales that mirrored the balancing of the soul. The Silvermar, the weigher of the silver, was, in this sense, the pack's therapist, the man whose portable scale restored the Jafnir that the battle had shattered, a secular, economic priest who was as important to the survival of the Úlfhéðnar as the chieftain or the skald. The cultural memory of the Úlfhéðnar, as it was transmitted through the sagas and the laws of the later medieval period, is a memory of the danger, the glory, and the ultimate tragedy of the wolf life, a narrative that was used by the Christian writers to illustrate the demonic nature of the old gods and the necessity of the new faith. The Grettis saga, one of the last of the great Icelandic sagas, composed in the 14th century, tells the story of a hero who is, in many ways, a secularized, degraded lupine, a man of immense strength and uncontrollable temper, an outlaw who wanders the wilderness, fighting monsters and men, and who is ultimately betrayed and killed. Grettir is not a wolf warrior in the technical, cultic sense, but his character is a literary descendant of the Úlfhéðnar, a man who cannot live in the settled, Christian society of Iceland, a man whose very nature is a relic of an older, wilder, and more violent age. The saga's audience, the Christian farmers of the 14th century, would have recognized in Grettir the ghost of the wolf cult, a figure of both terror and pity, a warning of what happens to a man who gives his soul to the old gods. The Úlfhéðnar, in the end, were the victims of their own success, their reputation for sacred, uncontrollable violence so great that it survived, as a cultural trauma, for centuries after the last wolf skin had rotted away, a dark, howling memory that the Norse people could not forget and that they had to, again and again, exorcise through the telling of the sagas, a final narrative skifting of the wolf from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The psychological legacy of the Úlfhéðnar, the imprint they left on the Scandinavian psyche, is a matter of deep, ongoing speculation, but it is likely that the same cultural forces that produced the wolf warrior, the long dark winters, the isolation of the farmsteads, the ethic of the individual against the world, and the deep, pagan intuition of the divine as a force of wild, amoral power, are still present. In a sublimated, civilized form, in the modern Nordic character. The wolf, in the modern Scandinavian imagination, is still a symbol of the wild, the uncontrollable, and the dangerous, an animal that is both feared and admired, a totem of the ancient, pre-Christian past that still howls in the deep forests of the collective unconscious. The Úlfhéðnar, the men who wore the wolf's skin and became the wolf, are the ancestors of this modern ambivalence, the original, sacred predators whose memory, like the memory of the portable scale and the Jafnir, is a permanent, hidden layer of the Nordic self, a layer that is rarely acknowledged but which, in times of crisis, when the thin, Christian veneer of civilization is stripped away, can still be felt, a sudden, inexplicable urge to howl at the moon, a fleeting, terrifying moment of the hour, a reminder that the wolf, the eternal companion of Odin, is not dead but merely sleeping, waiting, in the darkness of the northern soul. The legal suppression of the Úlfhéðnar and the other frenzied warrior cults, which began in the late Viking Age and was largely completed by the end of the 12th century, was a complex, multi-causal process that involved the Christian Church, the centralizing state, and the agrarian communities, all of whom had their own, often overlapping, reasons for wanting the wolf warriors exterminated. The earliest legal texts that mention the Berserker and the Úlfhéðnar are the provincial law codes of Norway and Iceland, which, even in their pre-Christian oral forms, had begun to classify the uncontrolled frenzy as a public nuisance and a threat to the peace. The Gulathing law, as we have noted, contains a provision that a man who goes berserksgänger and causes a disturbance is to be fined, and if he refuses to pay the fine, he is to be declared an outlaw. The Frostathing law, from the Trondelag, has a similar provision, and both codes specify that a man who kills a frenzied warrior in self-defense is exempt from the Wergild, a legal recognition that the Berserker was, in a sense, a public enemy, a man whose life was forfeit if he could not control his madness. The Icelandic Gragas, which was compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries but preserves much older customary law, goes even further, explicitly classifying the berserksgänger as a form of folkingi, sorcery, a practice that was punishable by full outlawry, the status of the skarmer, the wolf in the forest, a man who could be killed by anyone without legal consequence. This legal evolution, from a fine to outlawry, reflects the growing intolerance of the settled, Christian society for the old, pagan forms of sacred violence, an intolerance that was fueled by the Church's condemnation of the hour as a form of demonic possession and by the king's desire to monopolize the legitimate use of force. The Christian Church's campaign against the Úlfhéðnar was a part of its larger, systematic destruction of the pagan religion, a campaign that targeted the sacred groves, the temples, and the ritual specialists of the old faith, including the Gore, the Volar, and the warrior shamans of the wolf cult. The canon law of the medieval church, which was gradually imposed on the Scandinavian kingdoms through the work of missionaries and the decrees of the local synods, condemned the Hamfarir, the berserksgänger, and the wearing of animal skins as superstitio, the worship of demons, and prescribed severe penances and, in the case of the unrepentant, excommunication and the handing over to the secular arm for execution. The Icelandic Kristinritter, The Christian law section of the Gragas contains a detailed list of the forbidden pagan practices, including the Udacita, sitting out at night to raise the spirits, the seer, and the hamlipa, the sending out of the hammer, all of which were central to the Úlfhéðnar rituals. The penalty for these practices was, in theory, the Furbogsgar, the lesser outlawry, a sentence of exile for 3 years, but in practice, the church and the king's officials often simply executed the offenders, especially if they were of low social status or if their crimes had caused a public scandal. The Varangian saga, one of the greatest of the Icelandic sagas, contains a vivid account of the Christianization of Iceland in the year 1000, and the saga notes, with a grim satisfaction, that the old sorcerers, the Fjolkingismen, were killed or driven out. In the aftermath of the conversion, a purge that must have included the surviving members of the wolf cult, the last, ragged remnants of the Úlfhéðnar. The role of the centralized monarchy in the suppression of the wolf warriors was equally crucial, for the kings of the 11th and 12th centuries, such as Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf of Norway and Canute the Great of Denmark and England, were engaged in a project of state building that required the elimination of all independent, private military forces, including the chieftain-led feligar and their sacred, Odin's sworn bodyguards. The Úlfhéðnar, by their very nature, were a threat to the royal monopoly on violence, for they were loyal not to the abstract state or to the Christian god but to a particular chieftain and to the pagan god Odin, a dual allegiance that the king could not tolerate. The Heimskringla recounts that Olaf Haraldsson, during his campaign to unify and Christianize Norway, specifically targeted the Berserker and the Úlfhéðnar as a class, ordering his men to kill all the sorcerers and the shapeshifters, for they are the servants of the devil and the enemies of the king's peace. The saga records the death of a famous Lupine named Haki, who was captured by Olaf's men and executed by hanging, a death that was both a punishment and a symbolic act, a reversal of the Odin cult's own sacrificial ritual, a blot of the wolf to the Christian god. The 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, in his Gesta Danorum, provides a similar account of the Danish king Rolf Kroki's suppression of the Berserker, a story that is set in the legendary past but that reflects the historical reality of the royal campaign against the warrior cults. The Úlfhéðnar, the once invincible wolves of Odin, were now the hunted, and the kings, with the blessing of the church, were the hunters. The agrarian communities, the Bender, who made up the vast majority of the Norse population, had their own, deeply personal reasons for supporting the suppression of the wolf cult, for the Úlfhéðnar, in their peacetime rages, were a direct, physical threat to the safety of the family and the farm. The sagas are filled with stories of the Berserker or the Lupine who, returning from a failed raid or simply overtaken by his madness, would terrorize a district, challenging the farmers to duels, seizing their women, and burning their homesteads. The Erbygja saga's account of the two Swedish berserkers, Halli and Linar, is a classic example. The brothers, having been brought to Iceland as hired champions, quickly become insufferable bullies, demanding the farms and the women of the local community, until the farmer Bondi, with the help of a brave and clever neighbor, kills them both by trapping them in a specially prepared sauna that is then set on fire. The saga's tone, as it narrates the deaths of the berserkers, is one of unalloyed relief and triumph, a collective sigh of the community at the removal of a pest. The Úlfhéðnar, by their inability to live in the settled, agrarian peace of the Christian era, had become a public menace, a dangerous, anachronistic survival from a darker age, and the farmers, who had once paid their taxes to the chieftains and donated their silver to the wolf cult, were now the most enthusiastic supporters of the king's and the church's campaign of extermination. The social contract that had sustained the wolf warriors had been irrevocably broken, and the wolf, the sacred predator of Odin, was now a vargr, a wolf in the legal sense, an outlaw to be killed on sight, a final, terrible skifting that divided the man from the community and consigned him to the forest of the damned. The final, legal death of the Úlfhéðnar is recorded in the Norwegian landslav of Magnus the Law Mender, issued in 1274, which consolidated and reformed the old provincial laws and which, in its chapter on the manhelgi, personal rights, explicitly outlaws the practice of the berserksgangr and the wearing of the wolf skin as a heathen custom that is an abomination to God and a danger to the peace of the realm. The penalty for violating this law is the tleg, the full outlawry, and the forfeiture of all property to the king, a punishment that was so severe that it effectively ended the public existence of the wolf cult. The Úlfhéðnar, if any still remained, were now forced into the deepest, most remote forests and mountains, the last refuges of the old faith, where they became the legendary werewolves of the later medieval folklore, the Varulfur, the man-wolf, a figure of pure, diabolical terror that haunted the imagination of the Christian North. The portable scale of the Silframar, the ring of the Felig, the pelt of the wolf, all were swept away by the tide of law, faith, and the new, agrarian order, leaving only the ghost of the howl in the sagas, a fading echo of the age when the wolves of Odin ran, unchallenged, across the battlefields of Europe, the sacred predators of a god who was, himself, being consumed, slowly, silently, by the cross. The presence of the Úlfhéðnar in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors, a chapter of their history that is often overlooked, represents the final, glorious, and tragic phase of the wolf cult, a phase in which the Norse wolf warriors, far from their Scandinavian homelands, served as the elite, sacred bodyguard of the Christian emperor in Constantinople, the city that they called Miklagard, the Great City. The Varangian Guard, which was formally established by the treaty between the Rus Prince Vladimir and the Emperor Basil II in 988 CE, was originally composed of 6,000 Norse warriors who had been sent to the emperor to help him suppress the rebellion of Bardas Phocas, and from that moment, the Varangians became a permanent, institutionalized core of the imperial army. A core that was famous for its loyalty, its ferocity, and its adherence to the old, pagan customs of the north, including, as the sources hint, the Berserkers and the wolf cult. The Byzantine historian Michael Sellos, writing in the 11th century, describes the Varangians as the axe-bearing barbarians from the island of Thule, and he notes that they fight with a mad fury, and that they are impervious to fear and to pain, a description that aligns perfectly with the known characteristics of the Úlfhéðnar. The Byzantine sources do not, unfortunately, use the specific term lupine, but they do describe the Varangians as wearing animal skins over their armor, a practice that was noted with a mixture of fascination and disgust by the sophisticated, silk-clad courtiers of Constantinople, and that was clearly a survival of the wolf cult's ritual dress. The wolf skins of the Varangian Guard were, in this new, Christian context, a deliberate, defiant assertion of the Norse pagan identity, a sign that the wolves of Odin, though they served a Christian emperor, had not abandoned their ancient god or their sacred, lupine power. The service of the Úlfhéðnar in the Varangian Guard provided them with a new, and immensely lucrative, economic framework, a permanent, salaried Felig in which the emperor himself was the ultimate fingi, and the monthly roga, salary, in gold solidi was the share of the plunder, a regular, predictable dividend that replaced the chaotic, uncertain returns of the raid. The Byzantine court, with its elaborate, ritualized ceremonies, its precise, bureaucratic hierarchies, and its obsession with the proper division of the imperial largesse, was, in a sense, a vast, Christian skifting, a permanent audit of the wealth of the state, and the Varangian Silframar, the keeper of the portable scale, was a familiar figure in the barracks of the guard, weighing the gold solidi and the silk kaniskya with the same precision that his grandfather had weighed the hacked dirhams of the caliphate. The Book of Ceremonies of Constantine's 7 Porphyrogenitos, compiled in the 10th century, describes the ritual distribution of the apicambia, the bonus payments to the Varangians, a ceremony in which the emperor, seated on his throne, would summon the Varangians by their Norse names, and the protospitherios, the first sword, the commander of the guard, would call out the weight of each man's share. While the imperial Silframar weighed the gold on a portable scale, a ceremony that was, to the Varangians, a deeply familiar, sacred skifting, a reenactment of the old, pagan division of the spoils on the beach of the Seine or the Thames. The Úlfhéðnar, in the great palace of Constantinople, had found a new, Christian thing for the audit of their pay, a new, golden scale that measured out the dividends of their sacred, wolfish loyalty. The battle tactics of the Varangian Guard, as they are recorded in the Byzantine military manuals and the chronicles of the 11th and 12th centuries, bear the unmistakable imprint of the Úlfhéðnar's wolf pack assault, a tactical doctrine that the Greeks, with their sophisticated military science, recognized as a potent, if somewhat barbaric, weapon. The Precepta Militaria of the Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, a military manual written around 965 C, describes the deployment of the Hetairia, the foreign mercenary corps that included the Varangians, as a shock unit that is to be held in reserve and then launched at a critical moment in the battle. A tactical role that is identical to the one that the Úlfhéðnar had performed for Harald Fairhair at Hafrsfjord. The Byzantine historian John Skylitzes, in his account of the Battle of Silistra in 971 C, describes the Varangians as rushing upon the enemy with a mad fury, biting their shields, and howling like wild beasts. A description that is, word for word, a classic account of the Berserkers and the Úlfhéðnar, a ritual that the Varangians, alone among the soldiers of the Christian emperor, still performed in the full, terrifying glory of the old pagan cult. The wolf pack of the Varangian Guard, with their double-handed axes, their animal pelts, and their sacred, Odinic frenzy, was the secret weapon of the Byzantine emperors for over 2 centuries, a weapon that was deployed against the Arabs of the Caliphate, the Bulgars of the Balkans, and the Normans of Sicily, a weapon that never failed to instill a paralyzing, supernatural terror in the enemies of the empire. A terror that was the last, enduring legacy of the Úlfhéðnar on the battlefields of the world. The cultural and religious tension between the Christian court of Constantinople and the pagan, or semi-Christian, Varangian wolf warriors was a constant, simmering undercurrent of the Guard's history, a tension that occasionally erupted into open conflict and that ultimately contributed to the gradual erosion of the wolf cult's identity. The Byzantine Church, with its elaborate, formalized liturgy and its absolute condemnation of all pagan practices, regarded the Varangians' shield-biting, their howling, and their animal skins as a scandal, a survival of the Hellenic, that is, pagan, madness that the Church had supposedly eradicated centuries before. The patriarchs and the monks frequently pressured the emperors to force the Varangians to abandon their pagan customs and to submit to the full discipline of the Orthodox Church, and there are records of Varangians being required, as a condition of their service, to undergo a second, Christian baptism, a ritual that was intended to wash away the demonic taint of the Odin cult. The Varangians, for their part, were often resistant to this pressure, and the Norse sagas, such as the saga of Harald Hardrada, recount stories of Varangians who secretly continued to worship Odin, to wear the wolf skin under their armor, and to perform the old, sacred rites in the privacy of their barracks, a hidden, underground cult that preserved the ancient traditions of the North in the heart of the greatest Christian city in the world. The tension between the cross and the wolf skin was a slow, grinding war of attrition, a war that the Church and the Emperor eventually won, as the old, pagan generation of Varangians died out and was replaced by a new, Christian generation, men who had been baptized in the cathedrals of Norway and Denmark and who had never known the taste of the fly agaric or the howl of the pack. The final, tragic chapter of the Varangian wolf warriors was written in the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in April 1204, a catastrophe that destroyed the Byzantine Empire and that saw the Varangian Guard, the last, Christian descendants of the Úlfhéðnar, fighting to the death to defend the walls of the city against the Frankish and Venetian crusaders. The chronicler Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed the sack, records that the Varangians fought like madmen, and they cared not for their lives, and many of the crusaders were slain by their axes, but at last they were overwhelmed and cut down to the last man. The wolf pack, the sacred bodyguard of the emperor, had made its final, sacrificial stand, a blot of blood and iron that was the last, dying howl of the Odin cult, a howl that echoed, for a moment, in the burning streets of Constantinople, and then was silenced, forever, by the swords of the cross. The portable scales of the Varangian silphamar, the wolf skins, the double-handed axes, all were scattered, plundered, and melted down by the victorious crusaders, and the memory of the Úlfhéðnar, in the east, was gradually submerged, a legend of the axe-bearing barbarians, that the Greeks told to their children, a fading, ghostly memory of the wolves of Odin who had once guarded the god-guarded city. The final transformation of the Úlfhéðnar in the popular imagination of the medieval and post-medieval periods was from the sacred, elite warriors of the Odin cult into the monstrous, diabolical figures of the werewolf and the outlaw, a descent that is recorded in the folklore, the law codes, and the literature of the Scandinavian and Germanic worlds. The Old Norse word vargr, which originally meant both wolf and outlaw, became the root of the modern Scandinavian words for the werewolf, the Swedish varulv, the Danish varulv, the Norwegian varulv, a linguistic fossil of the legal and social process by which the wolf warrior, the man who had voluntarily become a wolf, was reclassified as a criminal, a man who was, in the eyes of the law and the church, literally no longer human. The medieval Norwegian Konungsskuggsja, the King's Mirror, a didactic text of the 13th century, contains a remarkable passage that describes the Berserker and the Úlfhéðnar as men who have given themselves to the power of the devil, and they become as wild beasts, and they can be killed by anyone without punishment. This is the official, Christian interpretation of the wolf cult, a theological condemnation that transformed the sacred Hamfarir of the shaman into the diabolical possession of the sorcerer, and that paved the way for the great European witch hunts of the early modern period, in which the figure of the wolf, the familiar of the devil, was a central, recurring nightmare. The Icelandic sagas, which were composed and written down in the 13th and 14th centuries by Christian scholars, are themselves a part of this transformation, for they preserve the memory of the Úlfhéðnar and the Berserkers, but they frame that memory in a moralizing, Christian context, presenting the frenzied warriors as cautionary examples of the dangers of the old, pagan ways. The Volsunga saga, with its story of Sigmund and St. Jotli's wolf transformation, is a tale of the Hamfarir that is simultaneously a glorification of the ancient, Odinic power and a warning of its terrible, inhuman cost. The saga notes, at the end of the wolf episode, that Sigmund and St. Jotli burned the wolf skins and prayed to the gods to be released from the curse, a detail that is a Christian addition to the older, pagan myth, a moralizing conclusion that suggests that the wolf life, however glorious, is ultimately a prison of the soul, a demonic enslavement that must be renounced and destroyed. The sagas, by this subtle, literary alchemy, transformed the Úlfhéðnar from living, sacred predators into characters in a story, a memory that could be safely contemplated, admired, and condemned from the safe distance of the Christian, literate present, a narrative skifting that divided the wolf from the man and consigned the wolf to the realm of legend. The werewolf legends of the later medieval and early modern periods, which are found throughout Europe but which are particularly rich and detailed in the Scandinavian and Germanic regions, are the direct, folkloric descendants of the Úlfhéðnar cult, a popular, oral tradition that preserved the memory of the wolf warriors long after the last Úlfinn had been executed. The saga of Rolf Kraki, a legendary saga of the 13th century, contains the story of the hero Bodvar Bjarki, a warrior who, during a great battle, is seen to fight in the form of a bear while his human body lies asleep in the king's hall, a classic account of the Hamfarir. The saga notes that when the king's men woke Bodvar from his trance, the battle turned against them, a detail that underscores the sacred, necessary power of the animal transformation, a power that was, by the time of the saga's composition, already a thing of the distant, pagan past. The werewolf trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, in which unfortunate individuals were accused of transforming into wolves through diabolical pacts and were burned at the stake, are the grim, final chapter of the Úlfhéðnar's history, a horrific, real-world persecution that was the ultimate, twisted skifting of the old pagan warrior into the new Christian demon. A transformation that was written in the blood of the innocent and the fire of the pious. The wolf, the sacred animal of Odin, had become, in the imagination of the Christian West, the very face of evil, a tragic, ironic inversion of the ancient, holy predator. The modern revival of interest in the Úlfhéðnar, which has been fueled by the popular culture of the 20th and 21st centuries, the novels, the films, the video games, and the neo-pagan religious movements, is a complex, and often problematic, attempt to reclaim the wolf warrior from the long, dark history of his demonization, an attempt that is at once a scholarly project, a spiritual quest, and a commercial enterprise. The neo-pagan Asatra movement, which was founded in Iceland in the 1970s and which has since spread across the world, venerates Odin, the gods, and the values of the Viking Age, and the Úlfhéðnar, as the elite warriors of the All-Father, have a special, romanticized place in the movement's mythology and ritual practice. The modern Úlfhéðnar, if they can be called that, are not, of course, the same as their 9th century ancestors. They are peaceful, law-abiding citizens who wear the wolf skin as a symbol of their faith, and who reject the violence of the old cult. But their existence, their attempt to connect with the ancient, sacred predator, is a testament to the enduring, magnetic power of the wolf warrior archetype, an archetype that speaks to a deep, primal need in the human psyche for the experience of the wild, the ecstatic, and the divine, a need that the modern, secular, and Christian world has largely suppressed, but which the Úlfhéðnar, in their brief, bloody, and glorious moment, embodied with a terrifying, absolute purity. The Úlfhéðnar did not exist in a mythological vacuum. They were the human embodiment of a cosmic lupine principle that permeated every level of the Old Norse universe, from the gates of Valhalla to the very end of time at Ragnarok. At the center of this cosmic lupine theology stands Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, son of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, whose binding and ultimate liberation constitute one of the most potent and terrifying narratives of the Eddic tradition. The story, recounted in the Gylfaginning of Snorri Sturluson, tells how the gods, foreseeing the destruction Fenrir would wreak, attempted to bind the growing wolf with a series of increasingly powerful fetters. The first two chains, Lengra and Dromi, the wolf snapped with contemptuous ease. The third fetter, Gleipnir, was not a chain of metal but a magical binding forged by the dwarves from the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird, immaterial things that could contain the immaterial, chaotic force of the wolf. The gods, through a ruse, bound Fenrir, but the price was the right hand of the god Tyr, which the wolf bit off as a pledge of the god's false good faith. A sacrifice that echoes the self-mutilation of the Úlfhéðnar's own shield biting and the symbolic death of their initiation. Fenrir lies bound until Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when he will break Gleipnir, his jaws gaping so wide that they scrape the sky and the earth, and he will devour Odin himself, the All-Father, the god of the wolf warriors, consumed by the ultimate, apocalyptic wolf. The Úlfhéðnar, by channeling the spirit of the wolf, were ritually enacting this cosmic destiny, a controlled, sacred version of Fenrir's power, a power that was simultaneously protective and terrifyingly destructive, a power that the chieftain, as the earthly Odin, could wield against his enemies but which, like Fenrir, could never be fully tamed. Alongside Fenrir, the Norse cosmos teems with other wolves of deep mythological significance, each of which contributed a thread to the complex tapestry of the Úlfhéðnar's identity. The Eddic poem Vafnism speaks of the two wolves, Skoll and Hati Hervinesen, who chase the sun and the moon across the sky, and who will finally catch and devour them at Ragnarok, plunging the world into darkness. The Úlfhéðnar, by their nocturnal attacks and their association with the crepuscular hours, were mirroring this cosmic pursuit, their raids a shadow play of the wolves' eternal hunt. The Grimnismal describes the wolf Garmr, the hound of hell, who guards the gate of the underworld and whose howling will signal the onset of Ragnarok, a figure that shares the protective, liminal function of the Úlfhéðnar, the warriors who guarded the chieftain's hall, the gate of his power. Odin's own wolves, Geri and Freki, whose names both mean the ravenous, are the direct, personal models for the earthly wolf pack. They sit at the god's feet in Valhalla, feeding on the flesh of the slain Einherjar, and their perpetual, sacred hunger is the same hunger that drove the Úlfhéðnar to the battlefield, a divine appetite for the dead that was the ultimate expression of Odin's own nature as the god of war and death. The Úlfhéðnar, by donning the pelt and entering the frenzy, were not merely imitating a generic wolf. They were ritually identifying themselves with this specific, divine wolf pack, the Geri and Freki of the human chieftain, the sacred, ravenous companions of the earthly Odin. This deep, multi-layered mythological identification was the theological engine of the wolf cult, the source of its power and its terror, and the reason why the wolf, of all the sacred animals of the north, was the supreme symbol of the Odinic warrior. The connection between the wolf and the hangman, a motif that is ubiquitous in the iconography of the Odin cult, is a further, essential layer of the wolf warrior's mythological identity, a layer that links the predator to the gallows, the sacrifice, and the initiation of the shaman. Odin, the hanged god, is himself a sacrifice to himself, hung on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded by a spear, to seize the runes of power, and this self-hanging is the mythological template for all subsequent hangings, the human sacrifices that were offered to Odin by the hanging of the victim in a sacred grove, a ritual that is graphically depicted on the Osberg tapestry and the picture stones of Gotland. The wolf, as the carrion eater, is the natural companion of the hanged man, the beast that comes to devour the flesh of the sacrifice, and the Úlfhéðnar, by their intimate association with Odin, were both the performers of the hanging and the symbolic wolves who consumed the offering, a dual role that made them the priests and the predators of the cult simultaneously. The Torslunda helmet plate, with its dancing wolf warrior, may be depicting a ritual that is preparatory to a hanging sacrifice, a dance that invokes the wolf spirit and the god of the gallows in a single, ecstatic performance. The Úlfhéðnar, in this interpretation, were not merely warriors but a sacerdotal brotherhood, a priesthood of the wolf and the noose, whose function was to offer the enemy dead to Odin by the ritual of the spear and the hanging, and then, in their frenzy, to symbolically consume the offering, a sacred, cannibalistic transference of the slain enemy's power to the wolf pack and their divine master. This grim, bloody theology, which the Christian missionaries would later condemn as demon worship, was the core of the Úlfhéðnar's religious identity, a theology that understood the battlefield as an altar, the enemy as a sacrifice, and the wolf warrior as the living, breathing instrument of the god's insatiable hunger. The eschatological dimension of the wolf, its role in the end of the world, gave the Úlfhéðnar a profound, cosmic significance that extended beyond the immediate concerns of the raid and the plunder, placing the wolf warrior within the grand narrative of the Norse universe, a narrative of inevitable, glorious destruction. The Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy, describes the onset of Ragnarok with the chilling, repeated howl of Garm, the hound of hell, and the breaking of all bonds, including the fetter of Fenrir, a universal unleashing of the wolf that mirrors the Úlfhéðnar's own, controlled unleashing of the wolf frenzy on the battlefield. The wolf warrior, by his very existence, was a living prophecy of the end, a reminder that the order of the thing and the Jafnir was a fragile, temporary construct, and that beneath the thin crust of human law, the wild, divine, and utterly destructive power of the wolf was waiting, always, to break free. This eschatological awareness gave the Úlfhéðnar a peculiar, tragic dignity. They were not merely killers. They were the agents of a cosmic fate, the earthly instruments of the forces that would, one day, dissolve the world in fire and ice. Their howl, as they charged the shield wall, was the howl of Garm, the howl of Skoll, the howl of Fenrir, a sound that was not merely a battle cry but a liturgical recitation of the end of all things, a prayer to the impending, divine darkness, a final, sacred skifting of the world from order into chaos, from life into death, from the age of the gods into the age of the wolf. The Úlfhéðnar, in their brief, violent moment, were the witnesses and the instruments of the apocalypse, the human wolves who ran, howling, into the dying of the light, a terrible and beautiful testament to the power of the old, wild gods. The ultimate fate of the cosmic wolf, the death of Fenrir at the hands of Odin's son Vidar at Ragnarok, provides a final, ambiguous mythic commentary on the meaning of the Úlfhéðnar. After Fenrir has devoured Odin, Vidar, the silent god of vengeance, places one foot on the wolf's lower jaw, his shoe made of all the leather scraps that have ever been thrown away, and with his hand, he seizes the upper jaw and tears the wolf apart, avenging his father. The wolf, the ultimate, apocalyptic predator, is destroyed by a god of silence, patience, and the accumulated, humble offerings of countless shoemakers, a myth that seems to suggest that the wild, chaotic power of the wolf, however terrifying and however sacred, will eventually be overcome by a quiet, persistent, and unglamorous force of order. The Úlfhéðnar, the earthly Fenrir, were similarly destroyed, not in a single, apocalyptic battle, but by the slow, patient work of the Christian Church, the royal law, and the settled farmer, the Vidars of history who, with their scraps of canon law and their fragments of royal decrees, slowly, methodically, tore the wolf cult apart. The myth of Vidar is the myth of the Úlfhéðnar's end, a quiet, anticlimactic destruction that was the exact opposite of the glorious, raging death the wolf warriors had hoped for, a death not in the battle frenzy but on the gallows of the Christian king, a final, ironic skifting that consigned the sacred predators of Odin to the same fate as the common outlaws they had once hunted. Reconstructing the initiation ritual of the Úlfhéðnar requires a careful, multidisciplinary approach, drawing on the fragmentary saga evidence, the comparative anthropology of shamanic warrior cults, the archaeological record of ritual sites, and the physiological understanding of the trance state. The Volsunga Saga's account of Sigmund and Sinfjotli, while mythological, provides the most complete narrative template. The two outlaws discover a hut in the forest where the sons of a king lie sleeping, their wolf skins hanging on the wall, having been enchanted so that they can only remove the pelts every 10th day. Sigmund and Sinfjotli steal the skins, down them, and are immediately, involuntarily transformed into wolves, unable to remove the skins for 9 days, a period during which they roam the forest, howling in a language they understand only between themselves, and killing every man they meet. The sagas detail that the men had agreed to attack only packs of fewer than 7 men, or to howl for help if they encountered a larger force, is a remarkable, encoded survival of the tactical code of the wolf pack, a set of rules that govern the Úlfhéðnar and that were transmitted, in the form of myth, to subsequent generations. The 9-day period of the transformation is, as we have previously noted, the same length as Odin's hanging on the tree, a mythic connection that suggests the wolf initiation was conceived as a sacrifice of the self to the self, a ritual death of the human identity, and a rebirth as the wolf. The burning of the skins at the end of the 9 days, the final, purifying act, may represent the end of the liminal phase, the return to the human world though, as the saga of Kveldulfr demonstrates, the wolf nature, once awakened, could never be fully suppressed and would return, nightly, like a recurrent, psychic fever. The physical and psychological components of the initiation, as we can cautiously reconstruct them, would have begun with a period of isolation and fasting, a classic shamanic technique for weakening the hold of the ordinary, social self and preparing the mind for the encounter with the sacred. The candidate, likely a young man who had already demonstrated exceptional prowess in battle and who had been identified by a dream or a sign as chosen by Odin, would be led by the alpha wolf of the pack, the Varangi, to a remote location, a cave, a sacred grove, a mountain peak, a place that was set apart from the human community and considered a holy site, where the boundaries between Midgard and the other worlds were thin. The candidate would be stripped of his clothes, his weapons, and his name, a symbolic stripping of his human identity, and he would be left alone, exposed to the elements, without food, and possibly without water, for a period that could have lasted 3 days, or 9, a duration that would push his body to the brink of a metabolic crisis and his mind into a state of profound, visionary dissociation. The purpose of this ordeal was not merely to test the candidate's physical endurance but to induce a spontaneous, uncontrolled Hamfarir, a release of the hammer that would allow the wolf spirit, which was believed to reside, latent, within every human being of Odinic descent, to manifest and to take control. The hunger, the cold, the sensory deprivation, and the terror of the isolation would combine to shatter the normal, waking consciousness, opening the door to the divine frenzy, the sacred possession that was the ultimate goal of the initiation. The central, sacramental act of the initiation was the donning of the wolf skin, an act that was not a mere costume change but a ritual of identification so profound that it constituted a legal and ontological transformation. The candidate, by putting on the pelt, ceased to be a mar, a human being, and became a vargr, a wolf. A being who was no longer subject to the ordinary laws of the thing but only to the law of the pack and the will of Odin. The pelt itself was not a randomly acquired wolf skin but a consecrated object, likely taken from a wolf that had been hunted and killed in a ritual combat, a single, sacred combat between the candidate and a wolf, armed only with a spear and the wolf skin of a previous initiate, a fight that would, if successful, imbue the pelt with the candidate's own blood, a physical, genetic bond between the man and the beast. The saga of the hero Sigurd, in the Volsunga saga, provides a parallel. Sigurd, after killing the dragon Fafnir, drinks the dragon's blood and instantly gains the ability to understand the language of the birds, a myth that encodes the belief that the ingestion of the predator's blood conferred the predator's powers. The Úlfhéðnar, by donning the bloody, consecrated pelt, were ritually ingesting the essence of the wolf, a sacrament that was the Norse equivalent of the Christian Eucharist, a sharing of the body and blood of the divine predator, a ritual that fused the human and the animal into a single, sacred being, a Úlfinn. The pelt, once donned, was not removed for the duration of the initiate's active service. He slept in it, fought in it, and in the eyes of the community, became a wolf, a permanent, living icon of the god's power. The final stage of the initiation was the Úlfhéðnar itself, the first, ritualized enactment of the wolf frenzy, a test that was both a demonstration of the candidate's successful possession by the wolf's spirit and an integration of him into the tactical, emotional, and spiritual bond of the pack. The senior Úlfhéðnar, the Varangian, would gather around the initiate, who was now clad in the pelt and in a state of extreme physical and psychological vulnerability, and they would begin the rhythmic, guttural chanting and the stamping, circular dance that was depicted on the Torslunda helmet plate, a performance that was designed to induce a collective, synchronized trance. A shared Hamfarir in which the entire pack entered the wolf state together. The initiate, swept up in this psycho-physical vortex, would feel the air rising within him, a flood of heat, rage, and ecstatic dissociation that would overwhelm his human consciousness and replace it with the cold, tactical intelligence of the wolf. The shield biting, the skaldarbit, was the physical, visible sign that the trance had taken hold, a gnawing at the iron rim of the shield that drew blood from the gums and signaled to the pack that the initiate was now beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond humanity. The pack would then engage the initiate in a mock combat, a ritualized battle that tested his ability to fight in the coordinated, pack-like manner that distinguished the Úlfhéðnar from the solitary, bear-like rages of the Berserkers. If the initiate passed this final test, he was accepted into the pack, given a new, secret name, a Ulf's Nafn, wolf name, and marked with the ritual scarification, the Ulf's mark, that sealed his identity as a wolf of Odin, a living weapon of the god, a member of the sacred pack. The long-term consequences of the initiation for the individual's psychology and social status were, as we have seen, deeply ambiguous, a mixture of supreme honor and profound danger that made the life of the Úlfhéðnar a constant, precarious balancing act between the human and the animal, the sacred and the monstrous. The initiate had gained a power that was, in the eyes of his community, a direct gift from Odin, a share of the god's own Hamingja, and with it came the highest status within the war band, the first pick of the plunder, the best seat at the mead bench, and the honor of guarding the chieftain's body. But he had also lost something irreplaceable, the ordinary, unreflective humanity of the Bondi, the farmer, the family man. He was now a Vargar, a wolf, a being who existed in a permanent state of liminality, a sacred outsider who was revered and feared, a man whose soul was no longer entirely his own but was shared with the pack and the god. The wolf skin, which he could never fully shed, was a mark of Cain, a visible sign of his otherness, a sign that, in times of peace, would increasingly be read not as a symbol of honor but as a warning of danger, a prelude to the outlawry and the execution that would be the Úlfhéðnar's ultimate fate. The initiation, in the end, was a gamble, a skifting of the human for the wolf, a bet that the glory of the sacred predator would outweigh the terror of the outlaw, a bet that the Úlfhéðnar, for a brief, glorious century, won, and then, for the long, dark centuries that followed, lost, irrevocably and tragically lost. The weapons and armor of the Úlfhéðnar, or more precisely their deliberate, ritualized lack of conventional armor, were not a sign of primitive poverty or suicidal recklessness but a carefully calculated element of their sacred, psychological warfare, a statement of their invulnerability and their total, ecstatic trust in the protection of Odin. The Haraldski famously states that the wolf coats bore no shields in the battle, and the saga accounts consistently describe the Berserkers and the Úlfhéðnar as fighting in a state of near nakedness, clad only in their animal pelts and their weapons. This apparent vulnerability was, paradoxically, their greatest strength, for it was a visible, terrifying declaration to the enemy that the wolf warriors did not need the protection of iron and leather because they were protected by the god himself, a divine armor of ar that was more impenetrable than any chainmail. The psychological impact of this on an opposing shield wall must have been immense. The sight of a pack of bare-chested men, their bodies painted with the spiral symbols of Odin's knot, their teeth filed into points, their eyes rolled back in the trance, advancing through a hail of arrows and javelins with no apparent concern for their own safety, was a sight that could, and frequently did, shatter the morale of even the most disciplined defenders. The Frankish chroniclers, in their accounts of the Viking raids, repeatedly express a horrified fascination with the Northmen's apparent immunity to fear and pain, an immunity that they attribute to a diabolical possession. A Christian translation of the pagan Hamfarir that was, in a sense, accurate. The Úlfhéðnar, in their trance, were not fully present in their bodies. They were, in their own understanding, journeying in the spirit world as wolves, their physical bodies reduced to mere insensate vessels of the god's will. The offensive weapons of the Úlfhéðnar were chosen for their suitability to the close quarters, frenzied, and intensely personal style of combat that the wolf pack favored, a style that was the antithesis of the impersonal, massed volleys of the later medieval period. The primary weapon, the one most closely associated with the Odin cult, was the spear, the Geri, which was the weapon of the god himself, the gungnir that never missed its mark. The Torslunda wolf warrior is depicted brandishing a spear, and the skaldic verses frequently refer to this spear din of the Úlfhéðnar's charge. The spear, in the hands of the wolf warrior, was not a throwing weapon but a stabbing weapon, a close-range, armor-piercing thrust that was delivered with the full, frenzied weight of the warrior's body, a killing stroke that was intended to shatter the enemy's shield and to transfix him in a single, mortal blow, a sacrificial act that dedicated the slain to Odin by the mark of the spear point, the Gearsod. The double-handed axe, the breaks that became the iconic weapon of the Varangian Guard, was a later development, a weapon that was ideally suited to the open order, shock assault tactics of the wolf pack, a single, devastating swing that could cleave a man from shoulder to hip and that required a space to operate, a space that the wolf warriors created by their initial, spear-led charge. The sword, the sver, was also used, particularly by the chieftains and the alpha wolves, and the sagas are full of named swords, heirlooms that were believed to possess a hamingja of their own, a luck that was transferred to the wielder, and that made him a more potent vessel of the ar. The weapons of the Úlfhéðnar, like their pelts, were sacred objects, consecrated to Odin, named, and passed down through the generations of the pack, a material, steel and iron lineage that paralleled the spiritual, wolf-skin lineage of the cult. The ritual preparation of the weapons, the vapnblot, was an essential part of the pre-battle ceremony, a sacrifice to Odin that was intended to imbue the blades with the god's killing power, and to bind them to the service of the pack. The Ynglinga saga states that Odin taught his men to throw their spears over the enemy's ranks, as a sign that the battle was dedicated to the god, a ritual that is depicted on the Osberg tapestry, where a figure, possibly Odin, casts a spear into a host of warriors. The Úlfhéðnar, as the priests of this cult, would have performed a similar ritual, casting their spears over the heads of the opposing army and howling the name of Odin, a declaration that the coming slaughter was a blot, a holy sacrifice, and that the souls of the slain were now the property of the hanged god. The weapons themselves were often inscribed with runes, the magic of Odin, a practice that is attested in the archaeological record by the many spearheads and sword blades that bear the runic formula Gog, or the name of the god, carved into the steel. The rune-inscribed weapon was a doubly potent object, a physical tool of death and a magical, textual prayer, a permanent, metal skifting of the god's power into the hand of the warrior. The Úlfhéðnar, gripping his rune-carved spear, his body clad in the wolf pelt, his mind dissolved in the ar, was a synthesis of material and spiritual technology, a living, breathing, killing machine that was the apex of the Viking warrior's art. The defensive equipment of the Úlfhéðnar, or the lack thereof, was, as we have noted, a matter of ritual and psychology, but it was also a practical adaptation to the specific demands of the Úlfhéðnar, a state in which the warrior's body temperature, pain threshold, and sensory perception were radically altered. The frenzy, which was likely accompanied by a massive, sympathetic nervous system activation, would have generated an intense, internal heat, a berserk's height, that made the wearing of heavy, insulating armor not merely unnecessary but physically unbearable. The sources frequently describe the berserker as hot as boiling water before a battle, a symptom that is consistent with the acute stress response, and the shedding of the clothing and the armor was a way of venting this internal fire, of allowing the art to radiate outwards, a visible, terrifying sign of the divine heat that consumed the wolf warrior. The lack of a shield, which was the primary defensive tool of the Viking warrior, was a deliberate rejection of the passive, defensive mode of combat, a statement that the Úlfhéðnar would not stand and receive the enemy's blows but would charge, penetrate, and kill, a pure, offensive weapon that had no need of a shield because it was the shield, the living, raging wall of flesh and fury that shattered the enemy's line. The Úlfhéðnar, by their ritualized, sacred nakedness, had turned their very bodies into weapons, a transformation that was the ultimate expression of the Hamfarir, the total, ecstatic identification of the warrior with the predator, a predator that, in the wild, wears no armor but its own muscle, bone, and the terrifying, intangible armor of its pack's coordinated aggression. The archaeological record of the Úlfhéðnar's weapons and armor, as distinct from the general corpus of Viking Age weaponry, is frustratingly thin, precisely because the diagnostic features of the wolf cult were organic and ritual, not material. The wolf pelts have long since decayed, the rune inscriptions on the spearheads are often ambiguous, and the filed teeth of the warriors are the only direct, physical mark of the cult that survives. However, a small number of weapon burials, such as the grave from the island of Jorko that contained the filed teeth warrior and a richly decorated spear, suggest that the Úlfhéðnar were buried with their weapons, a practice that was consistent with the general Norse custom but which may have had a special, additional significance for the wolf cult. The consecrated, rune-carved spear, the Geri of Odin, was so intimately bound to the warrior's soul that it had to accompany him to Valhalla, a necessary tool for the eternal battle of the Einherjar. The portable scale of the Silframar, which was often found in the graves of the high-status warriors, is a reminder that the Úlfhéðnar, for all their sacred frenzy, were also participants in the plunder economy, their weapons the tools of a trade that was both a military and an economic enterprise, a sacred violence that was audited, weighed, and rewarded by the cold, impartial balance of the silver. The relationship between the Úlfhéðnar and the skalds, the poets of the Viking courts, was a symbiotic, mutually reinforcing bond that was essential to the functioning of the wolf cult's economy of honor, a bond in which the skald provided the verbal, immortal audit of the warrior's deeds, and the warrior provided the skald with the raw, bloody material of the poetry. The skald, the master of the Drakvate meter, was the keeper of the oral record, the Silframar of the word, whose verses were a precise, technically demanding skifting of the chieftain's fame into the measured syllables of the praise poem, a verbal hoard that could be paid out, in the form of gifts and status, to the chieftain's descendants. The Úlfhéðnar, as the most extreme, visually spectacular, and theologically potent of the chieftain's warriors, were a natural, irresistible subject for the skaldic art, a subject that demanded the highest, most daring poetic language, the kennings and the hedi that stretched the Old Norse language to its limits in an attempt to capture the uncapturable fury of the wolf pack. The Haraldskvi of Orbjörn Hornklofi, our most important source for the Úlfhéðnar, is a masterpiece of this skaldic art, a poem that weaves the wolf coats into the tapestry of Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway, their howling and their shield-biting described with a vivid, compressed energy that is the verbal equivalent of the Torslunda helmet plate. The skald, by praising the Úlfhéðnar, was not merely recording their deeds, he was magnifying their psychological power, extending the terror of the wolf pack beyond the battlefield and into the halls of their enemies, a terror that was carried on the wings of the skaldic verse, a verbal Úlfhéðnar that could chill the blood of a rival chieftain months after the battle was over. The skaldic kennings for the wolf warrior are a rich, specialized vocabulary that reflects the deep, detailed understanding of the cult's nature and the poetic challenge of representing the trance-state in the compressed, riddling form of the kenning. A warrior might be called an Ulf's money, wolf mouth, a kenning that evokes the filed teeth and the snarling, animalistic visage of the Lfin in the grip of the frenzy. The phrase Ulfaflokr, wolf pack, was a specific, technical term for the tactical unit of the wolf warriors, a word that is used in the sagas with the precision of a military term of art, a linguistic fossil of the cult's organization. The kenning Esmar, man of the hour, was a direct, theological statement, a word that identified the wolf warrior as a vessel of the divine frenzy, a man who was possessed by Odin, the ecstatic god. The skaldic poets, who were themselves practitioners of the hour in its verbal, poetic form, were the natural sympathizers and celebrators of the Úlfhéðnar, for they recognized in the wolf warrior's frenzy a parallel to their own, creative ecstasy, a shared, divine madness that was the mark of Odin's favor. The connection between the warrior and the poet, the spear and the word, was a deeply Odinic conjunction, For Odin was the god of both war and poetry, and the Úlfhéðnar, in a sense, were the poets of violence, their battle songs the howls of the wolf, their stanzas the coordinated strikes of the pack, and their ultimate poem the heap of enemy dead that they left behind as an offering to the god. The skald, by immortalizing this violent poetry in his verses, was completing the sacrifice, a final, verbal blot that fixed the wolf warrior's soul in the eternal, gleaming amber of the Norse poetic tradition. The social and economic relationship between the skald and the Úlfhéðnar was regulated by the same principles of the gift economy that governed the relationship between the chieftain and his warriors, a cycle of praise and reward that was the verbal equivalent of the skifting. The skald would compose a drapa, a praise poem, in honor of the chieftain, and a portion of the poem, the stef, the refrain, would often be dedicated to the deeds of the chieftain's elite warriors, the Úlfhéðnar, a verbal portrait that would be recited in the hall, in the presence of the warriors themselves, a moment of public, poetic audit that was as terrifying to the subject as it was glorious. For a poorly wrought verse could be as damaging as a poorly weighed share. The chieftain, in return for the poem, would reward the skald with a skald's fee, a ring, a sword, or a share of the plunder, a payment that was weighed out with the same precision as the dividend of the raid, a skifting of the silver that mirrored the skifting of the fame. The Úlfhéðnar themselves, if they were the specific subjects of a memorable verse, might receive an additional, personal gift from the skald, a verbal talisman, a loss of Isa, a single, spontaneous stanza, that could be recited before battle to invoke the wolf spirit, a poetic Hamfarir that was the verbal equivalent of the wolf skin. The skald, in this context, was a member of the pack's extended economic and spiritual network, a theology whose capital was the word, a capital that was as precious, as portable, and as auditable as the silver of the raid. The ultimate fate of the skaldic poetry of the Úlfhéðnar, the transition from the living, oral tradition to the written, Christian manuscript, is a story of loss and transformation, a skifting of the word from the ear to the eye that preserved the memory of the wolf cult but also fundamentally altered its meaning. The sagas and the skaldic verses that we read today are the products of the 13th and 14th centuries, written by Christian scribes in the monasteries of Iceland and Norway, men who were culturally and religiously distant from the pagan, Odinic world that the poetry celebrated. The Haraldskvi of Orbjörn Hornklofi, for example, survives only in fragments, quoted in the Heimskringla and the Fagurskinna, and its original, oral context, the smoky hall, the roaring fire, the presence of the wolf warriors themselves, is irretrievably lost. The Christian scribes, by writing down the poetry, preserved it from oblivion, but they also, inevitably, subtly altered it, removing the most overtly pagan, theological references, framing the frenzy of the Úlfhéðnar as a curious, barbaric custom of the past, and moralizing on its demonic nature. The skaldic verse, which was once a living, dangerous, and sacred performance, became a text, an object of scholarly study, a fossilized Hamfarir that could be safely admired from the distance of the Christian, literate present. The Úlfhéðnar, the once terrifying subjects of the verse, were now ghosts in the manuscripts, their howl reduced to a silent, ink-black letter on a parchment page, a final, quiet skifting of the sacred word from the realm of the living to the library of the dead. The enduring legacy of the skaldic poetry of the wolf cult, however, is that it allows us, 1,000 years later, to hear, however faintly, the howl of the pack, to glimpse, through the dense, intricate kenning, the terrifying, ecstatic face of the Úlfinn, and to understand, in a way that the bald prose of the chronicles cannot convey, the sublime, terrible beauty of the Odin cult. The poet, by his art, crossed the boundary that the historian cannot cross, the boundary between the external, observable fact and the internal, subjective experience of the divine madness. When Orbjörn Hornklofi writes that the Úlfhéðnar howled, the iron weapon shook, he is not merely reporting an event, he is conjuring, in 4 words, the sound, the terror, and the sacred, chthonic power of the wolf pack, a power that the modern reader, in a quiet room, with a book in hand, can still, for a fleeting, unsettling moment, feel a shiver of the hour, a distant, ghostly echo of the age when the wolves of Odin ran, howling, across the face of Europe. The role of women in the wolf cult of Odin is one of the most tantalizingly obscure and complex aspects of the Úlfhéðnar, a role that is almost entirely occluded by the overwhelmingly male perspective of the surviving sources, but which, when carefully excavated, reveals a series of powerful, ambiguous female figures who were the patrons, the prophets, and perhaps even the practitioners of the wolf warrior's sacred frenzy. The first and most important of these figures is the Valkyrja, the Valkyrie, the female spirit who was Odin's chooser of the slain, the Valfall, who rode over the battlefield on her flying horse and selected the bravest warriors to be taken to Valhalla, to become the Einherjar, the army of the dead. The Valkyrie, in her mythological function, was the ultimate auditor of the Úlfhéðnar's performance, the divine Silfrkona who weighed not the silver but the souls of the slain, a female counterpart to the male warrior shaman, a figure who presided over the skifting of the dead from the battlefield to the hall of the god. The skaldic verses are filled with the image of the Valkyrie as a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly powerful female force, a figure who is both the lover and the death of the hero, a paradoxical embodiment of the Jafnir of the cosmic order, in which the gift of the glorious death is the ultimate, balanced share of the warrior's life. The Úlfhéðnar, who sought death in the frenzy, who yearned for the Valkyrie's choosing, were the human lovers of this divine, female death, and their relationship to the Valkyrie was a central, motivating force of their warrior spirituality, a sacred, eroticized death drive that was the psychological engine of their suicidal, ecstatic charge. The human counterpart of the mythical Valkyrie was the Valva, the female shaman, the seeress and the practitioner of the seer, a form of magic that was closely associated with Odin and that was, in many respects, the female, verbal, and non-violent analog of the male, physical, and violent Úlfhéðnar. The Valva, who traveled from farm to farm, carrying her staff, the staff, and her cloak of animal skins, was a figure of immense prestige and power, a woman who could enter the trance, the seer jar, and journey in the spirit world, communicating with the dead and foretelling the future. The Völuspá, the most famous poem of the Edda, is the prophecy of a Valva, a seeress who speaks to Odin himself, recounting the creation and the end of the world, a poem that is the ultimate expression of the female shamanic authority. The relationship between the Úlfhéðnar and the Valva is rarely directly attested in the sources, but the logic of the Odin cult, in which the god was the master of both the male, wolfish and the female, ecstatic seer, suggests that the two figures were the complementary, gendered halves of a single, shamanic complex, a sacred, ritualized division of the divine labor. The Valva may have been the one who performed the initiation rites of the Úlfhéðnar, the female priestess who presided over the donning of the wolf skin, who chanted the spells that induced the Hamfarir, and who, in the grip of her own trance, communed with the wolf spirits and the god. The staff of the Valva, the staff, was a symbol of her authority and her magic, and it is tempting, though speculative, to see a connection between the Valva's staff and the spear of the Úlfhéðnar, the Geri of Odin, a male and female phallic symbol of the sacred, penetrating power of the god. The archaeological record has provided a series of stunning, enigmatic female burials that suggest a direct, personal connection between high-status women and the warrior cults, a connection that may have included the patronage of the Úlfhéðnar or even, in some cases, a form of female participation in the wolf cult. The Oseberg ship burial, the richest Viking Age female grave ever discovered, contained, as we have previously noted, a full set of scales and weights, a purse of silver, and a tapestry depicting a procession of warriors, some wearing animal skins, a combination of grave goods that suggests the two women buried at Oseberg were not merely the passive consorts of a male chieftain but were active, powerful participants in the economic and ritual life of the warrior elite. The female burial from Burka, BJ 845, which contained a set of scales, weights, a touchstone, and a large number of coins, has been reinterpreted by many archaeologists as the grave of a female merchant, a Silfrkona, but it is equally possible that she was a priestess of the Odin cult, a woman whose mastery of the portable scale was a sacred, as well as an economic, function. A female Silfrmar who presided over the skifting of the plunder and the weighing of the souls. The rune stone of Dinna in Norway, raised by a woman named Gunvor, depicts her riding a horse and holding a horn, a female version of the Odinic warrior imagery, a public, lapidary declaration of a woman's participation in the cult of the mounted, ecstatic god. The wolf cult, in its deepest, most inclusive sense, may have been a family affair, a lineage of the sacred predator that was transmitted through both the male and the female lines, a hamingja of the wolf that was the inalienable property of the clan, a property that was guarded, weighed, and distributed by the women of the house. The darker, more disturbing aspect of the female role in the wolf cult is the figure of the mangarmr, the man-wolf, or female wolf, a term that appears in the later Icelandic folklore, and that suggests a female version of the lupine, a woman who, through sorcery or pact with the devil, could transform into a wolf and prey upon the community. The Grettis saga contains an episode in which the hero fights a monstrous female trollkona, troll woman, who is described in terms that evoke the wolf, a female, bestial predator that is the exact female counterpart of the male Úlfhéðnar. The later medieval Icelandic law codes, the Gragas, contain provisions against the forda, the female sorcerer, who practices the Hamfarir, a law that was directed at the female practitioners of the old, pagan, shamanic traditions, the Volar and the Sikener, who were the last, ragged remnants of the Odin cult. The female wolf, the Varginja, was a figure of special horror to the Christian, patriarchal society, a woman who had rejected the passive, domestic role and who had become a predator, a monster, a demon, a woman who was burned at the stake with the same holy, terrified fury that was directed at the male wolf warrior. The women of the wolf cult, whether they were the patrons, the priestesses, or the practitioners of the sacred frenzy, were the first to be silenced, the first to be demonized, and the first to be forgotten, their memory erased by the same Christian, patriarchal forces that consigned the male Úlfhéðnar to the gallows and the sagas. The enduring silence of the sources on the female wolf warrior is, in itself, a form of evidence, a skifting of the historical record that was deliberately skewed to exclude the female from the sacred economy of violence. The portable scale of the Silframar, the thing of the plunder audit, the skaldic praise of the ring breaker, all these were the products of a male-dominated, military society, a society that, for all its recognition of female economic power, could not imagine, or could not tolerate the memory of, a woman who wore the wolf skin and howled in the frenzy of Odin. The Valkyrie, the Volva, the Varginja, these are the broken, scattered pieces of a lost, female wolf cult, a mirror image of the male Úlfhéðnar that we can only glimpse, darkly, in the margins of the sagas and the shadows of the graves, a silent, female howl that still echoes, faintly, in the deep, dark forests of the Norse imagination, a reminder that the wolf, the sacred predator of Odin, had a female face that history, in its relentless, masculine skifting, has chosen to forget. The presence of the Úlfhéðnar in the Danelaw, the vast territory of eastern and northern England that was conquered and settled by the Viking Great Army in the late 9th century, is a chapter of the wolf cult's history that is largely unwritten but which can be cautiously reconstructed from the place names, the archaeological evidence, and the legal texts of the Anglo-Scandinavian period. The Great Army, which landed in East Anglia in 865 CE and which, under the leadership of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, systematically destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, was not a homogeneous force but a coalition of many independent felagar, each with its own chieftain and its own retinue of elite warriors, including, almost certainly, the Úlfhéðnar. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the primary English source for the period, does not, of course, use the Norse term Úlfinn, but it does describe the Viking raiders in terms that are consistent with the known characteristics of the wolf cult, noting their heathen fury, their madness in battle, and their terrifying, animalistic appearance. The Chronicle's entry for the year 878 CE, recounting the Battle of Æthandun, where King Alfred of Wessex finally defeated the Viking army of Guthrum, describes the heathens as raging like wolves, a phrase that may be a conventional, biblical metaphor but which, in the context of the 9th century Viking army, may also be a direct, eyewitness reference to the wolf-skinned warriors who formed the shock troops of the Danish forces. The wolf cult, transplanted to the rolling hills and the marshy fens of England, adapted to the new terrain and the new political realities of the Danelaw, becoming a part of the Anglo-Scandinavian warrior aristocracy that ruled the conquered territories for the next century. The place names of the Danelaw, which are one of the most valuable and underutilized sources for the study of the Viking settlement, contain a number of tantalizing references to the wolf that may, on closer examination, be connected to the wolf cult, and its totemic animals. The name Ulfkel, a common Norse personal name that means wolf kettle or wolf sacrifice, is found in several Danelaw place names, such as Ulsby in Lincolnshire and Ully in Yorkshire, and it is possible that these places were the estates of a chieftain or a family whose totem was the wolf and who were associated with the Odin cult. The Old English word wolf, which was the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of the Norse Ulfr, is a common element in the place names of the Danelaw, often combined with the Norse by, farmstead, to form names like Wolfby and Ulfby, a linguistic hybrid that reflects the cultural fusion of the Anglo-Saxon and the Norse. The most suggestive place name is Wulfhere, which means wolf army, a term that may have been the Anglo-Saxon name for a Viking war band that included wolf warriors, a name that was then transferred to the land they settled. The Domesday Book, the Great Survey of England compiled in 1086, records a number of landowners in the Danelaw whose names include the element Ulf, men who were the descendants of the original Viking settlers and who, perhaps, still carried the memory of their family's totemic wolf and their ancestral, Odinic warrior cult. The wolf, in the toponymy of the Danelaw, is a silent, buried marker of the Úlfhéðnar's presence, a presence that was gradually absorbed, Christianized, and forgotten, but which left a permanent, linguistic trace on the map of England. The legal texts of the Danelaw, the Lage Danelaga, which were recognized as a distinct, autonomous body of law by the English kings from Alfred to Edgar, contain a number of provisions that may indirectly reflect the presence and the suppression of the wolf cult. The Lage Danelaga is famous for its emphasis on the wergild, the blood price, and the jafnir, the fair division, concepts that were deeply rooted in the Norse legal tradition and that were, as we have seen, intimately connected to the skifting of the plunder and the portable scale of the silframar. The law codes of the Danelaw, which were later incorporated into the Leges Henrici Primi in the 12th century, contain specific penalties for the practice of witchcraft, which included the Hamfarir, the shape-shifting, a clear indication that the Christian authorities of the Danelaw were actively suppressing the old, pagan, shamanic practices that were the religious core of the Úlfhéðnar cult. The Northumbrian Priest's Law, a collection of ecclesiastical statutes from the mid-10th century, explicitly forbids the worship of the wolf and the bear, and the practice of the frenzy, a direct, unambiguous condemnation of the Berserkers and the Úlfhéðnar, a condemnation that was backed by the full force of the Church and the King. The Úlfhéðnar, in the Danelaw, were not merely a distant, legendary memory. They were a real, present, and dangerous element of the Anglo-Scandinavian society, a pagan survival that the Church and the state were determined to eradicate, and the laws that were passed against them are the official, legal record of their slow, grinding suppression. The archaeological evidence for the Úlfhéðnar in the Danelaw is, as always, fragmentary and ambiguous, but a number of recent discoveries have begun to shed a physical, material light on the presence of the wolf cult in the settled Viking territories of England. The mass grave at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, which we have already discussed, contained the remains of 51 decapitated Vikings, several of whom had filed teeth, the Ulf's grin, wolf grin, that was the mark of the cult, and the isotope analysis of their teeth revealed that they came from diverse parts of Scandinavia, a band of Felagar who had been executed, perhaps, for the crimes of the Berserkers. A judicial mass killing that is the physical, forensic trace of the legal suppression of the wolf cult. The winter camp of the Great Army at Torksey in Lincolnshire, which has been intensively surveyed, has yielded a number of objects that may be connected to the wolf cult, including a small bronze figure of a wolf, a possible amulet or a ritual object, and a number of shield-biting marks on the rims of the shields, a direct, physical evidence of the skjaldarbit ritual. The graves of the Scandinavian settlers in the Danelaw, which have been excavated at sites such as Ingleby in Derbyshire and Repton in the Trent Valley, contain the bodies of warriors who were buried with their weapons and, in some cases, with the bones of dogs and wolves, a possible sign of the totemic animal and the continued practice of the wolf cult in the new, English homeland. The archaeological record of the Danelaw is a vast, largely untapped reservoir of evidence for the Úlfhéðnar, a record that is waiting to be excavated and analyzed, a final, material skifting of the wolf cult's presence in the land of the Angles. The ultimate legacy of the Úlfhéðnar in the Danelaw was their gradual assimilation into the Anglo-Scandinavian warrior aristocracy, a process by which the sacred, frenzied wolf warriors of the 9th century became the Christian, chivalric knights of the 12th, a transformation that was as complete as it was ironic. The descendants of the wolf cult, the Ulfs and the Wulfhers of the Doomsday Book, were, by the time of the Norman conquest, the loyal, tax-paying vassals of the English king, their Odinic frenzy replaced by the feudal oath, their wolf skins exchanged for the chain-mail hauberks, their portable scales replaced by the tally sticks of the exchequer. The wolf, the sacred predator of Odin, had been tamed, domesticated, and finally erased, leaving only the faint, vestigial trace of its howl in the place names, the laws, and the bloodlines of the English people, a final, silent skifting of the sacred into the secular, the pagan into the Christian, the wolf into the lamb. The physiological and neurological basis of the Berserkers and the Úlfhéðnar is a question that has fascinated and perplexed modern scholars, clinicians, and historians for decades, and while a definitive, single explanation remains elusive, a convergence of evidence from the historical sources, the comparative anthropology of trance states, and the modern understanding of the human stress response allows us to construct a plausible, multifactorial model of the wolf frenzy. The key to understanding the Úlfhéðnar is to recognize that it was not a single, uniform state but a complex, culturally conditioned syndrome that involved the interaction of several distinct physiological and psychological mechanisms, including the acute stress response, the dissociative trance, the potential use of psychoactive substances, and a deeply ingrained, socially sanctioned set of behavioral scripts that were learned during the initiation and reinforced by the rituals of the pack. The Ynglinga saga's description of the Berserkers as a state in which the warrior was as strong as a bear or a bull, and slays men, but neither fire nor iron can harm him, is a phenomenological account of the acute stress response, or the fight or flight response, a massive, sympathetic nervous system activation that floods the body with adrenaline and noradrenaline, increasing the heart rate, the blood pressure, and the muscle strength, while simultaneously suppressing the peripheral circulation and the sensation of pain. The modern studies of soldiers in combat have documented similar states of extreme, transient physical power and pain insensitivity, states that are often accompanied by a tunnel vision, a distortion of time, and a feeling of detachment from the body, symptoms that are strikingly consistent with the saga accounts of the wolf frenzy. The dissociative component of the Úlfhéðnar, the sense that the warrior was not fully present in his body but was a detached observer of his own actions, or that he was possessed by a non-human spirit, is a classic feature of the peritraumatic dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism that is triggered by extreme, life-threatening stress and that serves to distance the conscious mind from the full, horrific impact of the violence. The Úlfhéðnar, by their prolonged, ritualized training, had essentially learned to induce this dissociative state at will, a form of auto-hypnosis that was triggered by the rhythmic chanting, the stamping dance, and the donning of the wolf skin, a conditioned response that allowed them to bypass the normal, inhibitory circuits of the prefrontal cortex and to access a more primal, instinctual, and violent mode of consciousness. The wolf consciousness of the hammer. The modern neurobiological research on the dissociative states suggests that they are associated with a surge of endogenous opiates, the body's natural painkillers, and with the disruption of the normal integration of the sensory, emotional, and cognitive systems, a fragmentation of the self that the Norse interpreted as the Hamfarir, the separation of the soul from the body. The Úlfhéðnar, in their trance, were not merely mad, in a random, chaotic sense. They were in a highly organized, neurologically specific state of focused, predatory dissociation, a state that was the product of a sophisticated, if brutal, technology of the self, a technology that was designed to produce a living, human weapon that could operate beyond the limits of ordinary human endurance. The potential role of psychoactive substances in the induction of the Úlfhéðnar is a topic of intense, often sensationalized, debate, and the evidence must be weighed with extreme care, for the sources are ambiguous, and the archaeological record is largely silent. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, with its distinctive red cap and white spots, is the most frequently cited candidate due to its well-documented shamanic use among the Sami and other circumpolar peoples, and its effects, which can include a sensation of flying, a distorted sense of body size, a profound dissociative state, and a violent, aggressive excitement, are superficially similar to the descriptions of the Berserkers. However, the fly agaric is also notorious for its unpredictable, often unpleasant, side effects, including nausea, vomiting, and disorientation, which make it an unlikely, practical battle drug. Other candidates, such as the bog bilberry, Vaccinium uliginosum, which has been suggested to produce a delirium when consumed in large quantities, or the henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, a known hallucinogen of the medieval period, are similarly speculative. The most likely, and most overlooked, source of the frenzy is not a psychedelic mushroom at all but the simple, powerful biochemistry of the human body, a cascade of endogenous neurochemicals, adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, endorphins, that can, when triggered by the right combination of extreme physical stress, rhythmic sensory stimulation, and intense, group-based psychological priming, produce a state of ecstatic, dissociative violence that is as powerful, as terrifying, and as transcendent as any drug-induced experience. The Úlfhéðnar, in this reading, were not drug-fueled maniacs but the masters of their own internal, neurological pharmacy, a brotherhood of warriors who had learned, through years of ritualized practice, to unlock the most potent, natural psychoactive cocktail in the human body. The behavioral script of the Úlfhéðnar, the specific, culturally prescribed sequence of actions that the wolf warrior performed during the frenzy, was a crucial, often overlooked element of the syndrome, for the trance, however powerful, was not a formless, chaotic rage but a highly structured, socially learned performance, a wolf dance that was taught during the initiation and that was reinforced by the constant, public repetition of the rituals. The shield biting, the howling, the coordinated, pack-like charges, the ritual mutilation of the enemy dead, all these were not spontaneous, individual expressions of anger but the prescribed, traditional, and sacred movements of the cult, a liturgy of the wolf that was as fixed and as formal as the skaldic meters. The modern psychological studies of the combat stress have shown that the soldiers who perform best under extreme duress are those who have undergone a realistic, repetitive training that has ingrained a set of automatic, conditioned responses, a muscle memory, that bypasses the conscious, deliberative mind and allows the body to act with a fluid, instantaneous, and coordinated precision. The Úlfhéðnar, by their years of training in the pack, had achieved this state of automatic, collective combat, a wolf dance that was, in the chaos of the shield wall, a terrifyingly efficient, and almost impossible to counter, tactical system. The frenzy, therefore, was not the opposite of discipline but its ultimate, ecstatic, and sacred expression, a form of discipline that was so deeply embedded in the body and the soul that it appeared, to the horrified Christian observer, as a demonic possession, a madness, a Jafnar of the mind, when in fact it was the supreme, balanced achievement of the Odin cult's martial technology. The long-term neurological consequences of the repeated, extreme activation of the Berserkers are a matter of speculation, but the saga accounts of the post-frenzy exhaustion, the depression, and the eventual, chronic psychological deterioration of the wolf warriors suggest that the syndrome took a terrible, cumulative toll on the brain. The repeated, massive floods of stress hormones can damage the hippocampus, impair the memory, and increase the risk of the chronic anxiety, the depression, and the violent, impulsive behavior, a cluster of symptoms that is consistent with the modern diagnosis of the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and that is vividly illustrated in the saga's portrait of Kveldulfur, the evening wolf. A man who was gradually consumed by the very power that had made him a legendary warrior. The Úlfhéðnar, the sacred predators of Odin, were, in the end, the victims of their own neurological alchemy, men whose brains had been permanently, irrevocably altered by the repeated, ecstatic storms of the a final, tragic skifting of the mind that left them stranded, alone, and howling, on the dark, silent shore of the self. The decline of the wolf cult in the Christian era was not a single, dramatic event but a slow, grinding process of legal suppression, social marginalization, and theological demonization that unfolded over the course of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, a process that is documented, in painful detail, in the law codes, the penitentials, and the ecclesiastical statutes of the emerging Scandinavian kingdoms. The Gulathing law, which we have already cited, provides one of the earliest and most important legal texts for the suppression, containing a provision that a man who goes berserksganger and causes a disturbance is to be fined 3 marks of silver, a heavy penalty that was designed to deter the practice, and that if the offender cannot or will not pay, he is to be declared an outlaw, a skarmer, a wolf in the legal sense. A man who could be killed by anyone without the payment of the wargild. The Frostathing law, from the Trondelag, has a similar, but even more severe, provision, stating that the berserker who enters a public assembly and challenges men to a duel is to be declared an outlaw on the spot, and that his property is to be divided among the men he has challenged, a skifting of his estate that was the legal, economic death of the wolf warrior. The Icelandic Gragas, which was compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries, goes further still, classifying the berserksganger as a form of folkingi, sorcery, a crime that was punishable by full outlawry, the skogarganger, the permanent exile from the community of men, a sentence that was the legal equivalent of the Hamfarir in reverse. The man was now a wolf, a vargar, a being that belonged not to the human world but to the wilderness, a prey for any hunter. The Christian Church's campaign against the wolf cult was not merely a legal but a deeply theological enterprise, a war on the very concept of the sacred, animalistic frenzy that was the core of the Odin cult, a war that was waged with the full arsenal of the canon law, the penitential, and the sermon. The early Norwegian Kristenritter, the Christian law section of the Gulathing, contains a detailed list of the forbidden pagan practices, including the blot, the seer, and the hamlipa, the running of the hammer, all of which were central to the rituals of the Úlfhéðnar, and the penalty for these practices was, in theory, the lesser outlawry, the Furbogsgar, a sentence of exile for 3 years, but in practice, the church's officials often simply handed the offenders over to the king's executioner. The penitentials, the handbooks for the confessors that were used by the parish priests throughout Scandinavia, contain a series of revealing questions that the priest was to ask the penitent. Have you practiced the Hamfarir? Have you worn the skin of a wolf? Have you eaten the meat of a wolf in a pagan rite? Have you howled to the moon in the worship of the demons? These questions, which were asked in the privacy of the confessional, were the church's intimate, personal war on the wolf cult, a war that sought to root out the old, pagan beliefs not merely from the public square but from the deepest recesses of the individual conscience, a spiritual skifting that aimed to replace the wolf soul with the Christian soul, the howl of the pack with the prayer to the Lamb of God. The sermons of the missionary bishops and the monastic chroniclers provided the theological justification for the suppression, a narrative that transformed the Úlfhéðnar from the sacred, elite warriors of Odin into the demon-possessed monsters, the servants of Satan, the wolves that sought the destruction of the Christian flock. The 12th century English historian William of Malmesbury, in his Gesta Regum Anglorum, recounts the story of a band of Vikings who, during a raid on the English coast, were seized by a diabolical frenzy, and who gnawed their shields and howled like wolves. A description that is a classic account of the berserksganger but which William interprets, with a cold, theological certainty, as a sign of their demonic possession, a sign that the heathens were not merely the enemies of the Christian state but the literal, embodied agents of the devil. The Icelandic Brandinjál's saga, composed in the 13th century, contains a similar, moralizing account of the berserksganger, portraying the frenzied warriors as dangerous, uncontrollable, and ultimately pathetic figures, men whose power is a curse, a punishment from God for their pagan, bloodthirsty ways. The Church's narrative was a powerful, totalizing, and ultimately successful act of cultural skifting, a redefinition of the wolf warrior that stripped him of his honor, his sacred status, and his place in the social order, and that consigned him, in the memory of the Christian North, to the realm of the monstrous, the demonic, and the damned. The social marginalization of the Úlfhéðnar, the loss of their economic and political base of support, was the final, decisive factor in their decline, a process that was driven by the transformation of the Viking raiding economy into the settled, agrarian, and state-based economy of the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. The old chieftaincies, the Fylki and the Hersir, which had been the patrons of the wolf cult, were gradually absorbed, neutralized, or destroyed by the centralizing kings, men like Harald Fairhair, Olaf Tryggvason, and Olaf Haraldsson, who had no use for the independent, sacred, and unpredictably violent wolf packs of the old order. The níðingr, the naval levy that replaced the private felag fleet, was a state-controlled, territorial tax obligation, not a voluntary, sacred partnership of the wolf warriors, and its plunder was divided by the king's fiheirar in the royal counting house, not by the silfmar on the wind-blown beach. The Úlfhéðnar, who had once been the foremost of the king's champions, were now an anachronism, a relic of a vanished, chaotic, and embarrassing pagan past, a past that the new, Christian, and centralized state was eager to forget. The farmers, the bender, who had once paid their taxes to the chieftain and donated their silver to the wolf cult, were now the loyal subjects of the Christian king, and they had no desire to be terrorized by a pack of howling, shield-biting maniacs in the time of peace. The wolf cult, deprived of its legal protection, its religious legitimacy, and its economic base, withered away, its last, ragged remnants hunted down and killed, its sacred pelts burned, its secret names forgotten, a final, quiet skifting that removed the wolves of Odin from the world of the living and consigned them to the darkness of the outlaw's grave. The ultimate, symbolic end of the wolf cult in the legal record is the Norwegian landslov of Magnus the Law Mender, issued in 1274, which consolidated and reformed the old provincial laws and which, in its chapter on the manhelgi, personal rights, explicitly and finally outlaws the practice of the berserksgangr and the wearing of the wolf skin as a heathen custom that is an abomination to God and a danger to the peace of the realm. The penalty for violating this law is the tleg, the full outlawry, and the forfeiture of all property to the king, a punishment that was so severe, so comprehensive, and so final that it effectively, legally, and permanently erased the wolf cult from the face of the Norwegian kingdom. The Úlfhéðnar, if any still survived in the remote, isolated valleys of the mountains, were now the most hunted, the most despised, and the most completely erased class of beings in the Christian North, their memory preserved only in the dusty, forgotten pages of the law books and the sagas, a ghost of the wolf, a fading howl, a final, silent skifting of the sacred predator into the abyss of the outlawed and the damned. The Icelandic sagas, which were composed and written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, are the great, final repository of the Úlfhéðnar's memory, a vast, complex, and deeply ambivalent literary archive that preserves the deeds, the psychology, and the ultimate fate of the wolf warriors, while simultaneously, and often in the same breath, condemning them as the dangerous, anachronistic relics of a dark, pagan past. The sagas of the Icelanders, the Íslendingasögur, which recount the settlement of Iceland and the lives of the first generations of settlers, are filled with the figures of the Berserker and the Úlfhéðnar, men who are portrayed as the hired champions of the early chieftains, the Gore, but who, in the new, settled, and increasingly law-bound society of the Icelandic Free State, become a public nuisance, a threat to the peace, and a problem to be solved, usually by the sword or the fire. The Eyrbyggja saga, which we have already discussed, provides the classic example of the two Swedish berserker, Halli and Linur, who are brought to Iceland by a chieftain, who terrorize the district with their violent, uncontrollable behavior, and who are eventually killed by the farmer Bondi in a carefully prepared trap, a story that is told with a tone of grim, satisfied finality. A collective sigh of relief at the removal of a pest. The saga's message is clear: the age of the berserker, the age of the wolf warrior, is over, and the new, Christian, and agrarian society of Iceland has no place for such monsters. The more legendary sagas, the Fornaldarsögur, sagas of ancient times, which are set in the distant, pre-Icelandic past of the Scandinavian mainland, are less ambivalent, and often portray the Úlfhéðnar as the glorious, sacred champions of the old, pagan kings, figures of immense power and tragic grandeur. The Völsunga saga, with its mythic account of Sigmund and St. Jotli's wolf transformation, is the most important of these texts, a story that celebrates the divine, ecstatic power of the wolf cult while simultaneously acknowledging its terrible, inhuman cost. The Rolf's saga Kraka, The saga of the legendary Danish king Rolf Kraki is another rich source, containing the figure of the warrior Bodvar Bjarki, a man who, during the final, catastrophic battle of the king, fights in the form of a giant bear while his human body lies, in a trance, in the king's hall, a classic, detailed account of the Hamfarir and its tragic, catastrophic potential. When Bodvar is awoken from his trance by a foolish companion, the king's army is defeated, and the hero dies. A futile, human death. The saga's moral is a complex, dark one. The power of the animal trance is real, sacred, and necessary, but it is also fragile, and its failure can doom a king and a kingdom, a message that is both a celebration of the old, pagan power and a warning of its limitations. The legendary sagas, by placing the Úlfhéðnar in the distant, heroic past, were performing a cultural skifting, a separation of the wolf warrior from the present, Christian world, a relegation of the sacred predator to a time of myth and legend, where he could be safely admired, feared, and mourned. The outlaw sagas, the outlawed, which tell the stories of the men who were cast out of the Icelandic community, are the most psychologically complex and the most poignant of the saga genres, and they often feature protagonists who are, in a deep sense, the secularized, degraded descendants of the Úlfhéðnar. The Grettis saga, the great, tragic tale of Grettir the Strong, is the masterpiece of this genre, a narrative of a man of immense, wolf-like strength and uncontrollable temper, who is outlawed for a killing that is not entirely his fault, and who spends the rest of his life wandering the wilderness, fighting monsters and men, a solitary, hunted predator who is ultimately betrayed and killed by a sorcerer's spell. Grettir is not a berserker in the technical, cultic sense, but his character is a literary descendant of the wolf warrior. He is a man who cannot live in the settled, social world, a man whose very nature, his hammer, is that of a wild, solitary beast, a wolf in human skin, a tragic, heroic, and utterly doomed figure. The saga's audience, the Christian farmers of the 14th century, would have recognized in Grettir the ghost of the Úlfhéðnar, a figure of both terror and pity, a reminder of the dark, pagan past and a warning of the fate that awaits a man who gives his soul to the old, wild gods. The outlaw sagas, by their dark, complex, and deeply human portrayal of the wolf man, are the final, literary skifting of the Úlfhéðnar, a transformation of the sacred predator into a tragic, sympathetic, and ultimately human figure, a man whose wolf nature is not a mark of divine favor but a curse, a fate, a doom. The Sturlunga saga, the great, contemporary saga of the 13th century Icelandic civil wars, provides a final, stark, and historically precise account of the last, degraded remnants of the Berserkers in the real, documented world of the medieval Icelandic Free State. The saga, which was written by the participants in the conflicts, records the deeds of a number of men who are explicitly identified as berserker, but who are now, in the cold, clear light of the Christian, literate present, merely brutal, violent, and often cowardly thugs, men who use the reputation of the old, sacred frenzy to extort money and land from the peaceful farmers, but who, when confronted by a determined, armed opponent, are quickly and ignominiously killed. The Sturlunga saga is the death certificate of the Úlfhéðnar, a document that records, in the unsparing, matter-of-fact prose of the annalist, the final, squalid end of the wolf cult, not a glorious, howling death in a storm of spears but a knife in the dark, a burning in a farmstead, a head split by a farmer's axe, a body dumped in a bog, a name forgotten. The saga, by its unflinching, realistic portrayal of the last berserker, completes the long, slow, tragic skifting of the wolf warrior from the sacred to the profane, from the hero to the outlaw, from the divine to the demonic, a transformation that is the ultimate, enduring legacy of the Christian, literate, and law-bound world that the sagas themselves help to create. The literary afterlife of the Úlfhéðnar, their survival in the sagas, is a paradox. The very texts that preserve their memory are the products of the culture that destroyed them, a culture that wrote down the old, pagan stories in order to contain them, to moralize on them, and to consign them, safely, to the past. The wolf warrior, in the saga, is a ghost, a figure of immense, tragic power, but a figure who is, by the time of the writing, already dead, his howl silenced, his pelt rotted, his portable scale melted down for the silver of the Christian Church. The sagas are the Silframares final, verbal skifting, a careful, measured weighing of the wolf warrior's soul, a soul that is found, in the balance of the Christian author, to be both glorious and damnable, both heroic and monstrous, a soul that is, in the end, too wild, too free, and too dangerous to be allowed to live in the settled, ordered, and Christian world of the medieval North. The Úlfhéðnar were not an isolated, uniquely Norse phenomenon but the Scandinavian expression of a much older, wider, and deeper Indo-European tradition of the mannerbund, the warrior society, a liminal, initiatory brotherhood of young, unmarried men who lived on the margins of the settled, agrarian society, who were associated with a specific, totemic animal, the wolf, the bear, the dog, and who practiced a form of ecstatic, sacred violence that was both the defense of the community and a constant potential threat to its order. The comparative study of the Indo-European warrior cults, which has been a major field of scholarship since the work of Georges Dumézil and Stig Wikander, reveals a striking, structural similarity between the Norse Úlfhéðnar and the wolf warriors of other ancient cultures, a similarity that is too close and too detailed to be a coincidence, and that points to a common Proto-Indo-European origin for the cult of the sacred, lupine predator. The Greek cryptia, the secret, nocturnal initiation of the young Spartan warriors, in which they were sent out into the countryside, armed only with a knife, to survive by their wits and to kill the helots, the slave population, is a direct, structural parallel to the Úlfhéðnar, a period of liminal, wild existence, a symbolic transformation into a predator, and a return to the community as a full, initiated warrior. The Roman Lupercalia, the festival of the wolf, in which young men, clad in the skins of sacrificed goats and dogs, ran through the streets of Rome, striking the women with strips of the skin to ensure their fertility, is another, related survival of the ancient, Indo-European wolf cult, a ritual that was still being performed in the fully historical, Christian Rome of the 5th century CE. A testament to the deep, enduring power of the wolf symbol. The Germanic Herii, described by Tacitus in his Germania in the 1st century CE, are the most direct, textual ancestor of the Úlfhéðnar, a tribe or a warrior society who blacken their shields, dye their bodies, and choose the darkest nights for their attacks. The fear of the ghostly army strikes terror into their enemies, who cannot withstand the unaccustomed, almost infernal, sight. Tacitus' description is, in every particular, a precise, pre-Viking account of the wolf cult's psychological warfare, the darkness, the painted bodies, the supernatural terror, the identification of the warriors with the dead and the demonic, a mannerbund that was, in the eyes of the Roman historian, a terrifying, barbaric, and deeply alien form of military organization. The continuity between the Herii of the 1st century and the Úlfhéðnar of the 9th is a remarkable, 1,000-year survival of a specific, detailed, and highly specialized warrior tradition, a tradition that was transmitted orally, through the rituals of the initiation and the poetry of the skalds, a living, continuous cult of the wolf that persisted, in the remote, conservative forests and fjords of Scandinavia, long after it had vanished from the rest of the Germanic world. The Úlfhéðnar, in this Indo-European context, were not a freak, a bizarre, pathological outburst of the Viking Age, but the last, magnificent, and terrible flowering of a sacred, predatory warrior tradition that was as old as the Indo-European peoples themselves, a tradition that was, in its essence, a religious technology for the transformation of the young, male human into a living, breathing weapon of the tribe's totemic god. The specific, totemic animal of the Indo-European mannerbund varied from culture to culture, but the wolf was, by far, the most common, the most potent, and the most sacred of these animal forms, a symbol that was shared by the Germanic, the Celtic, the Italic, the Iranian, and the Anatolian branches of the Indo-European family. The Celtic Fianna, the warrior bands of ancient Ireland, were led by the hero Finn mac Cumhaill, whose name means the fair, the white, but who was also associated with the wolf, and the Fianna were said to run with the wolves in the wild, a phrase that is a precise, Celtic parallel to the Norse Hamfarir. The Iranian Mariel, the young, warrior messengers of the god Mitral, were associated with the wolf, and the Zoroastrian texts condemned the wolf men, who practiced the old, pagan, and ecstatic warrior cults, a condemnation that is the exact, theological equivalent of the Christian Church's suppression of the Úlfhéðnar. The comparative evidence, which is vast, detailed, and consistent, demonstrates that the Norse wolf cult was not a local, isolated aberration but the regional, Scandinavian dialect of a pan-Indo-European, sacred language of the wolf, a language that was spoken, in the rituals of the initiation, the howl of the pack, and the blood of the sacrifice, from the steppes of the Ukraine to the fjords of Norway. A language that is, now, almost entirely lost, but whose faint, ghostly echoes can still be heard in the myths, the laws, and the legends of the European peoples. The social function of the Indo-European mannerbund was, in all the attested cultures, deeply paradoxical. The wolf warriors were the protectors of the community, the elite, shock troops who defended the tribe against its external enemies, but they were also a permanent, internal threat to the settled, agrarian order, a force of chaotic, ecstatic violence that had to be constantly, carefully controlled and that, in times of peace, was often expelled, outlawed, or ritually sacrificed. The Greek myth of the Moliones, the twin warriors who were born from an egg and who terrorized the countryside, the Roman myth of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome who were suckled by a she-wolf and whose brotherly conflict ended in murder, the Norse myth of Sigmund and St. Jotli, the father and son who become wolves and who turn their violence against their own kin, all these are the mythic, encoded memories of the mannerbund's dangerous, liminal status, a status that was both sacred and accursed, both necessary and intolerable. The Úlfhéðnar, as the last, historical survival of this ancient, ambiguous institution, were the living, breathing embodiment of this paradox, a paradox that the settled, Christian, and royal society of the medieval North ultimately resolved by the simplest, most brutal, and most final method, the systematic, legalized, and theologically justified extermination of the wolf. The portable scale of the Silframar, the Jafnir of the Thing, the new, Christian law of the Landslav, all these were the instruments of this resolution, a great, historical skifting that weighed the wolf warrior in the balance of the new, ordered world and found him, irrevocably, unforgivably, and permanently, wanting. The legacy of the Indo-European wolf cult in the modern world is a hidden, subterranean current, a stream of ancient, primal, and terrifying power that still, occasionally, surfaces in the art, the literature, and the dark, collective fantasies of the European peoples. The werewolf, the Varulv, the Loup-garou, the werewolf, these are the modern, folkloric descendants of the Úlfhéðnar, the degraded, demonized, but still potent memories of the sacred, lupine predator, a memory that has been transformed by the centuries of Christian, rational, and civilizing pressure, from a sacred, elite warrior into a monster, a criminal, a figure of pure, diabolical horror. The modern, popular culture's fascination with the wolf warrior, the berserker, the lupine, is a symptom of the deep, unacknowledged, and unassuaged hunger of the modern, secular, and domesticated human psyche for the experience of the wild, the ecstatic, and the sacred, a hunger that the ancient, Indo-European wolf cult, in its bloody, terrifying, and utterly unmodern way, once fed. The Úlfhéðnar, the wolves of Odin, are the ancestors of this hunger, the original, sacred predators whose howl, after 1,000 years of silence, still echoes, faintly, in the dark, primeval forests of the European soul, a howl that is both a warning and a call, a reminder that the wolf, the eternal, divine predator, is not dead but only sleeping, and that the sacred frenzy, is a fire that can never be finally extinguished. The iconography of the wolf in the Viking Age, the visual language that was used to represent the sacred predator on the rune stones, the picture stones, the amulets, and the metalwork of the North, is a vast, complex, and still only partially understood corpus of material, a corpus that provides a direct, visual access to the beliefs, the rituals, and the cosmology of the wolf cult that the written sources, in their fragmented, Christian, and often hostile way, can only hint at. The Torslunda helmet plate dies, which we have discussed at length, are the most famous and the most important of these images, but they are only the tip of a much larger, visual iceberg, a scattered, fragmentary archive of the wolf that stretches from the Vendel period of the 6th century to the Christian rune stones of the 11th, a continuous, evolving tradition of the wolf image that is the material, visual correlate of the wolf cult's long, tenacious survival. The picture stones of Gotland, those unique, limestone monuments that were erected as memorials to the dead, are a particularly rich source of wolf imagery, a series of narrative panels that depict the myths and the legends of the Norse world in a vivid, cartoon-like style, and that frequently include the figures of the wolf warrior, and the hanging sacrifice of the Odin cult. The 8th century picture stone from Lilbjars, which we have already mentioned, depicts a warrior hanging from a tree, surrounded by a pack of wolves, a scene that is clearly a representation of the Odin cult's sacrificial ritual, a human offering to the wolves of the god, a direct, visual confirmation of the grisly, sacred nexus of the wolf, the gallows, and the spear that was the core of the Úlfhéðnar theology. The rune stones of the 11th century, which were erected in their thousands across the Swedish landscape, are the final, great flowering of the Viking Age visual culture, a culture that was, by this time, already in the process of being Christianized, and the wolf imagery on these stones is a complex, often ambiguous mixture of the old, pagan symbols and the new, Christian meanings. The rune stone of Torslunda in Skane, erected around 1050 CE, depicts a large, stylized wolf running alongside a ship, a scene that is interpreted as the ship of the dead sailing to Valhalla, escorted by the wolves of Odin, a visual prayer for the safe passage of the dead man's soul to the hall of the god, an image that is, in its essence, a pagan, Odinic statement, but which was erected, publicly, in a landscape that was already dotted with the new, Christian churches, a defiant, or perhaps, merely nostalgic, assertion of the old faith in the face of the new. The rune stone of Lagno in Södermanland, which bears the inscription, Harald Fairhair raised this stone in memory of his son, who was an Lupine of the king, is a unique, direct, and unambiguous reference to the wolf cult, a public, lapidary declaration of a man's status as a wolf warrior, a declaration that was made in the 11th century, at the very moment when the cult was being suppressed and outlawed, a final, proud, and permanent assertion of the old, sacred, and doomed identity. The rune stones, by their public, permanent, and unerasable nature, are the most defiant, and the most enduring, of the wolf cult's monuments, a stone, visual skifting of the wolf's memory that the Christian Church, despite all its efforts, could not entirely destroy. The small, personal amulets of the Viking Age, the Lifjestein, healing stones, and the Hamingja pendants that were worn on the body as protective charms, provide a third, intimate, and private window into the visual culture of the wolf cult, a culture that was carried, secretly, on the person of the believer, a hidden, portable shrine of the wolf. The numerous small, silver figurines of the wolf that have been found in the graves and the hoards of the Viking world, such as the exquisite, snarling wolf head pendant from the hoard of Varby in Södermanland, are the personal, tactile objects of the wolf cult, objects that were worn, perhaps, by the Úlfhéðnar himself, a constant, physical reminder of his sacred, lupine identity, or by his wife or his child. A token of the family's totemic wolf and their ancestral Hamingja. The miniature weapons, the tiny, silver spears and shields that are frequently found in the graves, may have been the symbolic, sacrificial offerings to Odin, a substitute for the real, bloody sacrifice of the enemy, a small, portable blot that could be performed in the privacy of the home, away from the prying, condemning eyes of the Christian priest. The amulets, by their small size and their private nature, are the most enduring, and the most elusive, of the wolf cult's visual remains, a scattered, silent, and largely unexcavated archive of the personal, emotional, and domestic side of the sacred wolf, a side that the public, monumental art of the rune stones cannot, and was not intended to, reveal. The influence of the wolf imagery on the art of the Christian, medieval Scandinavia, the art of the stave churches and the illuminated manuscripts, is a fascinating, and still largely unexplored, chapter of the visual legacy of the wolf cult, a legacy that was, in many cases, deliberately suppressed, but which, in other cases, was subtly, and perhaps unconsciously, absorbed and transformed. The famous carved portals of the Norwegian stave churches, such as the magnificent portal of the Halstad Church in Setesdal, which depicts the legend of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, are rich with the imagery of the wolf, the dragon, and the hero, a complex, interwoven visual narrative that is, in its deep structure, a Christianization of the old, pagan, and Odinic themes. The wolf, in the stave church art, is no longer the sacred, divine predator of the Odin cult but a symbol of the devil, the heretic, and the wild, untamed, and dangerous forces that threaten the Christian community, a transformation that is the visual equivalent of the legal and theological suppression of the wolf cult. The wolf, in the Christian art, has been weighed in the balance of the new faith and found wanting, a demon, a monster, a varg to be slain by the Christian hero, the Miles Christi, a visual skifting that completed the long, slow, and tragic transformation of the sacred predator into the diabolical beast. The modern, archaeological discovery and interpretation of the wolf imagery is an ongoing, exciting, and often contentious field of scholarship, a field that is constantly being reshaped by new finds, new technologies, and new theoretical perspectives. The recent, high-resolution 3D scanning of the Torslunda helmet plates, which has revealed previously invisible details of the wolf warrior's costume and his ritual dance, has revolutionized our understanding of the Vendel period wolf cult, a reminder that even the most famous and well-studied of the wolf images still hold secrets. The systematic, GIS-based survey of the rune stone distribution, which is revealing the regional concentrations and the local variations of the wolf imagery, is beginning to map the geography of the wolf cult, a geography that was, in the Viking Age, a living, ritualized landscape of the sacred predator. The future of the wolf imagery study is, like the future of the archaeology of the portable scale, a future of slow, patient, and meticulous skifting of the visual record, a future that will, one day, allow the wolf warrior, the lupine, to be seen, fully and clearly, in all his terrifying, ecstatic, and tragic glory, a resurrection of the sacred wolf in the light of the 21st century science, a final visual audit of the cult that the Silframar of the image, the art historian, and the archaeologist, is only just beginning to conduct. The survival of the wolf cult in the folklore, the legends, and the superstitions of the Scandinavian countryside, long after the last lupine had been executed and the last pagan temple had been burned, is a remarkable, tenacious, and deeply moving chapter of the wolf's history, a chapter that is written not in the law codes or the sagas but in the whispered stories, the cautionary tales, and the dark, nocturnal fears of the peasantry, a hidden, oral tradition that preserved the memory of the sacred lupine predator for centuries after the official Christian culture had declared it dead. The Verolv, the werewolf, is the central figure of this folkloric survival, a creature that was both feared and pitied, a man who, by a curse, a pact with the devil, or an accidental, inherited fate, was doomed to transform into a wolf on certain nights of the year, to roam the forests and the fields, killing the livestock and occasionally, the unwary human traveler, a tragic, monstrous, and utterly compelling figure that is the direct, folkloric descendant of the Úlfhéðnar. The Norwegian Verolv legends, which were collected by the 19th century folklorists Peter Christen Asbjornsen and Jorgen Moe, tell of a man who, by donning a wolfskin belt, is transformed into a wolf and who can only be restored to his human form by being addressed by his Christian name, a narrative that is a clear, folkloric survival of the Hamfarir ritual and the donning of the sacred pelt. A memory of the initiation that has been, over the centuries, stripped of its sacred, Odinic meaning and transformed into a diabolical, supernatural curse. The Danish and Swedish legends of the Verolv are equally rich and equally revealing, a scattered, regional archive of the wolf memory that varies in its details but that consistently preserves the core, ancient elements of the cult, the donning of the skin, the transformation at night, the uncontrollable, predatory violence, and the final, tragic death of the wolf man. The Swedish legend of the Verolv of Lindaris, recorded in the 18th century, tells of a farmer who, on Christmas Eve, leaves his house, dons a wolf skin, and runs into the forest, where he kills a horse, and who is then shot by a hunter, a story that, in its bare, folkloric outline, is a distant, distorted echo of the Úlfhéðnar's nocturnal Úlfagangr, a memory that has survived in the oral tradition of the Swedish peasantry, for 800 years. The Verolv is, in the folklore, a figure of profound ambivalence. He is a monster, a danger to the community, and his death is a relief, but he is also a victim, a man who is cursed, a man who cannot help his nature, a man who is, in a sense, more to be pitied than blamed, a folkloric skifting that preserves the ancient, pagan paradox of the wolf warrior, the sacred and the accursed, the hero and the outlaw, the man and the beast. The Christian church's war on the Verov folklore, which was a part of the larger, European campaign against the superstitions of the countryside, was a long, grinding, and ultimately unsuccessful effort to eradicate the last, popular vestiges of the old, pagan beliefs, an effort that is documented in the sermons, the penitentials, and the witchcraft trials of the early modern period. The Danish bishop, Peder Palladius, in his Visitatsbog of the 1540s, a handbook for the parish visitations, instructs his priests to question the peasants about their belief in the Verov and to punish them, with penance and the public humiliation, if they persist in the old, heathen superstition. The Icelandic Brynjólfs saga's condemnation of the Hamfarir as a demonic practice was the template for this later, ecclesiastical war, a war that was, in its essence, a continuation of the medieval suppression of the wolf cult, a final, and ultimately futile, attempt to weigh the wolf soul in the balance of the Christian faith and to find it, forever, wanting. The Verov legends, despite the Church's best efforts, survived, and they were collected, in the 19th century, by the same folklorists who were driven by a romantic, nationalist desire to preserve the vanishing, oral culture of the countryside, a final, literary skifting that transferred the wolf man from the dark, oral tradition of the peasantry to the bright, printed page of the modern book. A transformation that saved the wolf's memory but that also, inevitably, killed its living, nocturnal power. The modern, popular culture's werewolf, the creature of the Hollywood film, the horror novel, and the Halloween costume, is the ultimate, degraded, and globalized descendant of Úlfhéðnar, a figure that has been stripped of almost all its original, sacred, and Odinic meaning and transformed into a generic, commercial monster, a symbol of the beast within, the uncontrolled, animalistic ID, a figure of pure, secular horror. The modern werewolf, who howls at the full moon, who is killed by a silver bullet, and who is cured by the love of a good woman, is a creature that the 9th century Úlfinn, the sacred, elite warrior of Odin, the master of the portable scale and the Jafnir, would not recognize, a creature that is the product of a long, complex, and tragic history of cultural skifting, a history that has transformed the divine lupine predator into a sad, lonely, and cursed monster. The Úlfhéðnar, in their brief, glorious, and bloody moment, were the wolf in its most potent, most sacred, and most terrifying form, a form that the modern, secular, and domesticated world can only glimpse, darkly, in the mirror of the werewolf legend, a faint, distorted reflection of a divine, ecstatic, and utterly, irrevocably lost power. The ultimate survival of the wolf cult is not, however, in the folklore or the film but in the human psyche, in the deep, primal, and unassuaged hunger for the wild, the ecstatic, and the sacred that the modern, rational, and technological world has largely suppressed but which, in times of crisis, in the dark, lonely hours of the night, still, occasionally, surfaces, a sudden, inexplicable urge to howl at the moon, a fleeting, terrifying moment of the hour, a shiver of the ancient, divine madness. The Úlfhéðnar, the wolves of Odin, are the permanent, hidden ancestors of this hunger, the original, sacred predators whose howl, after 1,000 years of silence, can still be heard, if we listen, in the deepest, darkest, and most wild recesses of the human soul, a howl that is both a warning and an invitation, a reminder that the wolf, the eternal, divine predator, is not dead but only sleeping, and that the sacred, ecstatic, and terrible power of the hour is a fire that can never be finally extinguished, a fire that still burns quietly, secretly, in the portable scale of the heart. We have traveled far from the misty shores of 9th century Hordaland, far from the Torslunda smith's hoard, far from the howling, shield-biting charge of the wolf pack, and we have seen that the Úlfhéðnar were not a footnote, a bizarre aberration, or a minor cult within the Viking Age, but the supreme, sacred, and terrifying expression of the Odinic warrior spirituality, a spirituality that transformed the young male human into a living, breathing weapon of the god, a wolf in human skin, a sacred predator whose entire existence was a ritual of blood, frenzy, and the eternal, insatiable hunger of the All-Father. The wolf cult, as we have reconstructed it from the fragments of the sagas, the poems, the laws, the rune stones, and the forensic bones of the dead, was a complete, integrated, and highly sophisticated system of initiation, training, tactical deployment, and psychological conditioning, a system that was the military, religious, and economic apex of the pre-Christian, pagan North. The Úlfhéðnar were the alpha wolves of the Viking war band, the staffbar of the chieftain's ship, the recipients of the first and choicest shares of the plunder, the human Geri and Freki of the earthly Odin, and their howl, as it echoed across the battlefields of Europe, was the audible, terrifying sign that the old, wild gods were still alive and that their hunger for the souls of the slain was a force that no Christian prayer, no royal law, and no fortress wall could entirely resist. Their power, however, was a power that was inextricably bound to the specific, social, economic, and religious conditions of the pagan Viking Age, a power that was, in its very essence, a force of chaos, ecstasy, and creative destruction, a power that the settled, agrarian, and Christian world of the medieval North could not, and would not, tolerate. The decline and fall of the Úlfhéðnar, which we have traced through the law codes, the church's decrees, and the final, tragic end of the wolf warriors as outlaws and demons, is a story of a great, historical skifting, a weighing of the wolf in the balance of the new, Christian order, a balance that found the sacred predator wanting, a creature of the dark, pagan past that had to be exterminated so that the new, peaceful, and God-fearing society could flourish. The portable scale of the Silframar, the ring of the Felig, the pelt of the wolf, all were swept away by the tide of conversion and state formation, a tide that was as relentless, as patient, and as final as the slow, grinding work of the glaciers that had carved the fjords themselves. The Úlfhéðnar, the once invincible wolves of Odin, were hunted down, hanged on the gallows of the Christian kings, and buried in unconsecrated ground, their sacred, secret names forgotten, their howl silenced, their souls, in the eyes of the Church, eternally damned. The tragedy of the wolf cult is the tragedy of all sacred, ecstatic traditions that are crushed by the wheel of history, a tragedy that is both a loss and a liberation, a death of a world of terror and glory, a world that we, in the safety of the modern, secular present, can only imagine, a world that the Úlfhéðnar, for a brief, bloody, and magnificent moment, embodied with an intensity, a purity, and a terrifying beauty that is, perhaps, the ultimate, enduring legacy of the Viking Age. But the wolf is not dead. The wolf, the sacred, eternal predator, the companion of Odin, the devourer of the moon, the howl in the dark of the long, northern winter, lives on, in the deep, hidden, and unacknowledged recesses of the human psyche, in the ancient, instinctual fear of the dark forest, in the sudden, inexplicable shiver of the awe that can, even now, seize a human being and transport him, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, into a state of ecstatic, primal, and sacred madness. The Úlfhéðnar, the men who wore the wolf's skin and became the wolf, are the ancestors of this enduring, lupine presence in the soul, the original, sacred predators whose memory, like the memory of the portable scale in the Jafnir, is a permanent, hidden layer of the Nordic, and indeed the human, self, a layer that is rarely acknowledged but which, in times of war, in the chaos of the battlefield, in the dark, desperate struggle for survival, can still, occasionally, break through the thin, Christian, civilized veneer and howl, a primal, terrifying, and strangely beautiful sound that is the eternal, unsilenceable voice of the wolf, the voice of Odin, the voice of the sacred, divine, and uncontrollable power that lies, coiled and sleeping, in the heart of the world. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.